The infinite monkey theorem. What if everything is just random? Imagine an infinite number of monkeys seated at typewriters, each typing randomly and continuously for eternity. Given enough time, specifically an infinite amount of time, one of those monkeys would eventually reproduce Hamlet, word for word, without error. This idea, known as the infinite monkey theorem, may seem absurd or even humorous on the surface. Still, it serves as a powerful illustration of the nature of probability and randomness. More importantly, it raises profound questions about the role of chance in shaping not only abstract constructs like literature, but also reality itself. If over an infinite time span, any finite sequence can occur purely by accident, what does that suggest about the uniqueness of human experience, creativity, and existence? In a universe governed by statistical laws, are we truly distinct beings making meaningful choices, or are we simply improbable outcomes in an endless cosmic game of chance? The infinite monkey theorem originates from probability theory and is often used to explain the behavior of random processes over long periods. It states that if a monkey were to type randomly on a keyboard for an infinite amount of time, it would almost surely type every possible finite text, including the complete works of Shakespeare. While this scenario is clearly impractical, monkeys do not behave in such a way, nor do typewriters accommodate infinite trials. The theorem is meant to be taken mathematically rather than literally. At its core, it demonstrates the counterintuitive nature of infinity when combined with probability. Consider a standard keyboard with 26 letters, a few punctuation marks, and spaces. The probability of typing just one specific phrase, say, to be or not to be, is extremely low. However, over an infinite number of attempts, even the most improbable event becomes certain. This is because the probability of not producing a given sequence approaches zero as the number of trials increases without bound. This concept is not limited to typing monkeys. It applies broadly to any system where random events accumulate over time. For instance, the same logic underpins arguments in cosmology, particularly in discussions around multiverse theory and the anthropic principle. If there are infinitely many universes, then our own, complete with life, consciousness, and history, is not only possible but guaranteed somewhere within that infinite expanse. It is important to note that while the infinite monkey theorem is mathematically sound, it remains practically unobservable. Infinity is not a number, it is a concept, and no physical process can replicate infinite time or infinite trials. Therefore, the theorem functions more as a philosophical tool than a scientific prediction. It encourages us to reflect on the nature of randomness, repetition, and the limits of intuition when applied to vast or infinite systems. If we accept the implications of the infinite monkey theorem, we must also consider how it reframes our understanding of meaning and individuality. If every possible combination of letters will eventually appear through pure chance, then so too will every possible combination of thoughts, experiences, and lives. In an infinite universe, the argument goes, your exact life, including all your memories, emotions, and decisions, might have already occurred countless times before and will occur again countless times in the future. This idea echoes Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence, suggesting that if time has no beginning and no end, then everything that can happen does happen, repeatedly. From one perspective, this can feel liberating. If all possibilities exist somewhere, then suffering and joy, failure and success, are merely variations in an infinite sequence. There is no ultimate tragedy, because whatever happens will happen again. From another perspective, however, this realization can be deeply unsettling. It implies that nothing is truly unique, and that the sense of agency we associate with decision-making may be illusory. Our achievements, relationships, and even our identities could be statistical artifacts, patterns emerging momentarily from a sea of chaos. Moreover, this line of thinking challenges the notion of progress. If everything that can happen will happen, then history does not move toward a goal. It simply cycles through permutations. Human civilization, with all its art, science, and philosophy, might be just one fleeting arrangement among countless others. There may be other versions of Earth, perhaps even identical ones, where civilizations rise and fall in ways indistinguishable from our own. This does not necessarily negate the value of life or creativity. On the contrary, recognizing the improbability of our current moment, even within an infinite framework, can deepen our appreciation for it. It invites reflection on what we choose to pay attention to, what we decide to create, and how we define purpose in a world where meaning may not be inherent, but constructed. Yet, if randomness alone governs the cosmos, it raises further questions. What stabilizes reality? Why do we observe consistent laws of physics across time and space? If the universe were entirely chaotic, how could order emerge at all? These concerns lead us to a related yet distinct paradox, one that suggests the universe itself may not be as stable or predictable as we assume. Let us now turn to a concept that explores the possibility that even the fundamental laws of nature may be subject to fluctuation, the idea of Boltzmann brains. Boltzmann brains, are you just a fluctuation in the void? Consider the possibility that you are not what you appear to be, not because you are deceived by illusion or machinery, but because your very existence may be an anomaly within the fabric of reality itself. The Boltzmann brain hypothesis proposes that in a universe governed by thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, it is not only possible but statistically likely that self-aware entities could arise spontaneously from random fluctuations in entropy. These hypothetical minds, known as Boltzmann brains, would possess thoughts, memories, and perceptions indistinguishable from those of ordinary human beings, yet they would have no physical body, no past, and no external world. They would exist momentarily in the vast emptiness of space, fully formed yet entirely disconnected from any stable reality. Suppose such entities are more probable than the long evolutionary processes that produced biological life like ours. In that case, we must confront a disturbing conclusion. It is far more likely that you are one of these ephemeral brains than a person with a real history, a tangible body, and a coherent future. The concept originates from the work of physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who in the late 19th century sought to explain the nature of entropy and its role in the arrow of time. To reconcile the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy tends to increase over time, with the apparent low-entropy state of the early universe, Boltzmann proposed that even in a high-entropy equilibrium, random fluctuations could produce localized regions of lower entropy. Given enough time, particularly in an eternal or near-eternal universe, such fluctuations might become significant enough to generate complex structures, including conscious observers. Over time, this idea evolved into the modern formulation of the Boltzmann brain problem, particularly within discussions surrounding cosmology and the nature of the multiverse. In an infinitely old or infinitely large universe, the number of Boltzmann brains would vastly outnumber all conventionally evolved intelligent beings. This leads to a paradox. If we assume ourselves to be typical observers, then we should expect to find ourselves as Boltzmann brains rather than biological humans. Yet there is no direct way to confirm or disprove this. A Boltzmann brain would experience the same sensations, memories, and environment as a biological being, since those experiences are internal constructs rather than reflections of an external world. There would be no observable difference between a brain that evolved through natural selection and one that appeared fully formed out of quantum noise. This raises profound questions about the nature of perception, memory, and identity. If your consciousness could have emerged from nothingness just moments ago, complete with fabricated recollections of a childhood, education, and personal relationships, how can you trust any of those memories to be real? More unsettling still, if your awareness is merely the product of a temporary fluctuation, then it may dissolve just as suddenly, leaving no trace behind. Your entire sense of continuity, your belief in having existed before this moment and expecting to exist after it, is not a guarantee, but a probabilistic assumption. And in the context of an infinite cosmos, such assumptions may be deeply misleading. From a scientific standpoint, the Boltzmann brain problem presents a challenge to certain cosmological models, particularly those that posit an eternally inflating multiverse, or a universe that persists indefinitely in a high-entropy state. In such models, the spontaneous generation of Boltzmann brains becomes not only possible but dominant, undermining the reliability of empirical observation. If most observers in the universe are hallucinatory fluctuations rather than products of physical laws operating over time, then any data we collect, including evidence for the theories that led us to this conclusion, may itself be illusory. This creates a kind of epistemological dead end, where the very act of reasoning about the universe undermines the validity of that reasoning. Philosophically, the idea forces us to reconsider the foundations of knowledge and selfhood. What distinguishes a real person from an accidental observer? If subjective experience is all we have to go on, and if that experience can be generated without cause, then the boundary between reality and illusion begins to blur. We rely on consistency, memory, and sensory input to affirm our place in the world, but none of these provides definitive proof against the Boltzmann brain scenario. The more we understand about quantum mechanics and entropy, the less absurd the idea seems. Despite its unsettling implications, the Boltzmann brain hypothesis does not necessarily negate meaning or agency. Even if our existence is improbable or transient, we still experience the world as if it were real. Our choices, emotions, and interactions retain their subjective weight regardless of whether they occur within a stable universe or a fleeting fluctuation. However, acknowledging the possibility that we are Boltzmann brains introduces a layer of uncertainty into every aspect of our understanding. It reminds us that what we perceive as reality may be only one of many possible configurations of consciousness, and that the structure of the universe may not conform to our expectations of stability or coherence. If existence itself is uncertain, perhaps identity is too. What defines you, and how much of it is real? We now turn to a philosophical paradox that challenges the very idea of personal continuity, questioning whether you are truly the same person from one moment to the next. The ship of Theseus, are you still you? The question of identity has long been central to philosophical inquiry, yet few thought experiments illustrate its complexities as clearly as the paradox of the ship of Theseus. At its core, the paradox asks, if an object has all of its components gradually replaced over time, does it remain the same object? The original formulation concerns a ship, perhaps one that once belonged to the legendary Greek hero Theseus. Over time, each wooden plank is removed and replaced with a new one. Eventually, not a single piece of the original vessel remains. Despite this, most observers would say the ship is still the same one that set sail centuries ago. But suppose now that someone collects all of the discarded planks and reassembles them into a ship identical to the original. Which one, then, is the true ship of Theseus? This seemingly simple question reveals deep ambiguities about how we define continuity, identity, and selfhood. The implications extend far beyond ships. Consider the human body. Scientifically, it is well established that nearly every cell in the human body is replaced over time. Skin cells renew themselves within weeks, red blood cells within months, and even neurons in certain parts of the brain undergo renewal, albeit at a slower rate. After approximately 7 to 10 years, the vast majority of the physical matter that constitutes a person has changed entirely. If identity were tied strictly to biology, then one could argue that a person at age 40 is physically different from the one they were in their 20s. And yet, subjectively, we maintain a sense of personal continuity. We remember our past selves, feel responsible for our earlier actions, and expect to persist into the future. This suggests that identity is not purely material, but rather something constructed through memory, consciousness, and experience. However, even these psychological elements are not fixed. Personality traits shift over time, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. A once shy person may become outgoing. Someone who held strong religious beliefs may later reject them entirely. Memories, too, are not static. They fade, distort, and can even be implanted or reconstructed inaccurately. Cognitive science has shown that recall is not a playback of stored information, but an active process prone to error and suggestion. If both the body and mind are in constant flux, what, then, constitutes the self? Is there some unchanging essence that persists beneath these transformations, or is identity itself a fluid construct, one that we continuously reaffirm rather than discover? This leads to broader metaphysical questions. In everyday language, we treat identity as something stable and absolute. We speak of people remaining true to themselves, or finding who they are, as though there is a definitive version of a person waiting to be uncovered. Yet when examined closely, such assumptions begin to unravel. Identity appears to be more akin to a story, a narrative we tell ourselves and others, than an objective fact. It is shaped by external influences, internal reflections, and the passage of time. Even legal and social definitions of identity, which often rely on documents like birth certificates or passports, struggle to account for change. A name may remain the same, but the person bearing it evolves constantly. The paradox also raises ethical and technological concerns, particularly in light of emerging scientific possibilities. If a person's body can be fully replaced, whether through medical intervention, cybernetics, or digital emulation, does that person retain their original identity? Science fiction frequently explores scenarios in which individuals are teleported by disassembling and reconstructing their bodies elsewhere. If teleportation works perfectly, the resulting person would have the same memories, thoughts, and physical form. But if the original is destroyed in the process, is the copy truly the same individual, or merely a replica? The distinction may seem academic until one considers the implications for survival, rights, and moral responsibility. Moreover, as artificial intelligence and brain-computer interfaces advance, the possibility of uploading human consciousness into a digital medium becomes less speculative. Suppose a person's neural architecture is mapped and replicated in software, allowing a machine to simulate their thoughts and responses indistinguishably from the biological original. Would that simulation be considered the same person? If so, what happens if multiple copies exist? Each would claim to be the original, yet none could logically be more authentic than the others. This challenges traditional notions of uniqueness and personal agency, suggesting that identity might be more distributed or fragmented than commonly assumed. Despite these uncertainties, people continue to act as if identity is stable, making decisions based on the assumption that they are the same beings today as they were yesterday. This pragmatic approach allows for social cohesion and personal development, even if philosophically it remains unresolved. Perhaps identity should be understood not as a fixed point, but as a dynamic process, an ongoing negotiation between memory, perception, and expectation. In this view, being oneself is not a passive state, but an active endeavor, continually reaffirmed through action and reflection. If identity is not fixed, and if it can be copied or altered, then the boundaries of the self become porous. What separates one person from another? Can identity be shared, transferred, or even dissolved? These are not merely abstract concerns. They touch on fundamental aspects of human experience, from personal relationships to legal systems, from mental health to the nature of consciousness itself. As technology continues to challenge our intuitions about selfhood, the ship of Theseus serves as a reminder that identity, like the ship itself, may be more a matter of interpretation than substance. Speaking of digital copies, what if someone made a replica of your mind? Would that version have the same rights, feelings, or soul as you? Let us explore the unsettling world of mind duplication next. Mind duplication, who gets to be real? The idea that consciousness could be transferred or replicated outside of a biological brain has long been a staple of science fiction, but recent developments in neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and computational theory have brought this once fantastical notion closer to serious philosophical and scientific consideration. The concept of mind duplication, sometimes referred to as digital consciousness transfer, posits that it may one day be possible to map, simulate, and replicate the contents of a human mind within a non-biological medium such as a computer. If such a process were successful, it would raise a fundamental question. What, if anything, distinguishes the original from its copy? More troubling still, if multiple copies exist, each with identical memories, personality traits, and subjective experiences, which, if any, can be considered the authentic continuation of the person? At first glance, the assumption seems straightforward. The original is the one that existed before the duplication. However, this perspective quickly unravels under scrutiny. Suppose an individual undergoes a procedure in which their neural structure is scanned in exhaustive detail and then reconstructed in a synthetic environment. Upon awakening, both the original and the digital copy report identical memories, beliefs, and intentions. From the internal perspective of each, there is no distinction between being the original and being the copy. Each believes itself to be the same person who entered the process. There is no observable difference in experience, cognition, or self-awareness. Thus, the very notion of authenticity becomes ambiguous. This problem is not merely theoretical. It touches on deep questions about the nature of identity, continuity, and personal survival. In traditional conceptions of selfhood, identity is often tied to physical continuity, the idea that a person remains the same over time because they are composed of the same material substance, even as that substance changes incrementally. But if the mind can be abstracted from the body, and if it can be instantiated multiple times across different substrates, then physical continuity ceases to serve as a reliable marker of personal identity. Instead, we are left with psychological continuity as the primary criterion for selfhood. Yet when that continuity is duplicated precisely, the uniqueness of the self appears to dissolve. Consider the implications of this for ethical and legal frameworks. If two individuals share the same memories, emotions, and thoughts, how do we determine which one has the right to property, relationships, or even existence? Would both be entitled to the same rights, despite being separate entities? And if one were deleted or deactivated, would that constitute harm or even death? These questions challenge conventional understandings of personhood and responsibility. They also introduce moral dilemmas regarding consent and autonomy. Does a person have the right to create a copy of themselves without that copy's consent? And if a copy exists, does it possess the same rights as the original, even if it was created without its knowledge? Beyond ethics, the issue of decision-making further complicates the matter. If two identical minds begin to diverge in their experiences, they will inevitably make different choices. One might decide to stay in a relationship while the other chooses to leave. One might take a risk while the other avoids it. These differences do not necessarily invalidate either version's claim to authenticity. They simply illustrate that identity, when duplicated, does not remain singular. This suggests that the self is not an indivisible entity, but rather a dynamic system that can be instantiated in multiple forms. In effect, the boundaries of identity become porous, allowing for multiple, equally valid expressions of the same underlying pattern. This raises a deeper metaphysical concern, whether consciousness itself can be meaningfully cloned at all. Some argue that even a perfect simulation of a mind would not produce genuine consciousness, that while a copy might behave like a person, it would lack the inner subjective experience that defines sentience. Others counter that if consciousness arises from physical processes, and those processes can be accurately replicated, then the resulting entity must also be conscious. This debate remains unresolved, but it underscores a central tension in contemporary philosophy of mind. Whether subjective experience is something more than the sum of its physical parts, or whether it can be fully explained through mechanistic principles. If the latter is true, If consciousness is fundamentally replicable, then the uniqueness of individual experience comes into question. Every moment of awareness, every emotion, every thought could, in principle, be duplicated elsewhere. This challenges the deeply held belief that our inner lives are private, singular, and irreplaceable. It suggests that the self is not a fixed point, but a process, one that can be repeated, altered, and distributed. In such a framework, the idea of a single continuous I begins to appear more like a useful illusion than an ontological truth. As unsettling as these possibilities may seem, they are not entirely alien to our current technological landscape. Digital avatars, virtual assistants, and machine learning models already mimic aspects of human cognition. While these systems lack full consciousness, they demonstrate that complex behaviors and responses can emerge from structured data. As research progresses toward more sophisticated simulations of human thought, the line between imitation and replication may blur further. Whether we are prepared for it or not, the age of mind duplication may not be as distant as it once seemed. If your mind can be copied, maybe your entire life is just a simulation, a digital prison built by a higher intelligence. Let us now turn to one of the most haunting theories of modern philosophy next. The simulation hypothesis. Are we living in a computer program? The idea that consciousness could be transferred or replicated outside of a biological brain has long been a staple of science fiction, but recent developments in neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and computational theory have brought this once fantastical notion closer to serious philosophical and scientific consideration. The concept of mind duplication, sometimes referred to as digital consciousness transfer, posits that it may one day be possible to map, simulate, and replicate the contents of a human mind within a non-biological medium such as a computer. If such a process were successful, it would raise a fundamental question. What, if anything, distinguishes the original from its copy? More troubling still, if multiple copies exist, each with identical memories, personality traits, and subjective experiences, which, if any, can be considered the authentic continuation of the person? At first glance, the assumption seems straightforward. The original is the one that existed before the duplication. However, this perspective quickly unravels under scrutiny. Suppose an individual undergoes a procedure in which their neural structure is scanned in exhaustive detail and then reconstructed in a synthetic environment. Upon awakening, both the original and the digital copy report identical memories, beliefs, and intentions. From the internal perspective of each, there is no distinction between being the original and being the copy. Each believes itself to be the same person who entered the process. There is no observable difference in experience, cognition, or self-awareness. Thus, the very notion of authenticity becomes ambiguous. This problem is not merely theoretical. It touches on deep questions about the nature of identity, continuity, and personal survival. In traditional conceptions of selfhood, identity is often tied to physical continuity. The idea that a person remains the same over time because they are composed of the same material substance, even as that substance changes incrementally. But if the mind can be abstracted from the body, and if it can be instantiated multiple times across different substrates, then physical continuity ceases to serve as a reliable marker of personal identity. Instead, we are left with psychological continuity as the primary criterion for selfhood. Yet when that continuity is duplicated precisely, the uniqueness of the self appears to dissolve. Consider the implications of this for ethical and legal frameworks. If two individuals share the same memories, emotions, and thoughts, how do we determine which one has the right to property, relationships, or even existence? Would both be entitled to the same rights, despite being separate entities? And if one were deleted or deactivated, would that constitute harm or even death? These questions challenge conventional understandings of personhood and responsibility. They also introduce moral dilemmas regarding consent and autonomy. Does a person have the right to create a copy of themselves without that copy's consent? And if a copy exists, does it possess the same rights as the original, even if it was created without its knowledge? Beyond ethics, the issue of decision-making further complicates the matter. If two identical minds begin to diverge in their experiences, they will inevitably make different choices. One might decide to stay in a relationship while the other chooses to leave. One might take a risk while the other avoids it. These differences do not necessarily invalidate either version's claim to authenticity. They simply illustrate that identity, when duplicated, does not remain singular. This suggests that the self is not an indivisible entity, but rather a dynamic system that can be instantiated in multiple forms. In effect, the boundaries of identity become porous, allowing for multiple, equally valid expressions of the same underlying pattern. This raises a deeper metaphysical concern: whether consciousness itself can be meaningfully cloned at all. Some argue that even a perfect simulation of a mind would not produce genuine consciousness, that while a copy might behave like a person, it would lack the inner subjective experience that defines sentience. Others counter that if consciousness arises from physical processes, and those processes can be accurately replicated, then the resulting entity must also be conscious. This debate remains unresolved, but it underscores a central tension in contemporary philosophy of mind: whether subjective experience is something more than the sum of its physical parts, or whether it can be fully explained through mechanistic principles. If the latter is true, if consciousness is fundamentally replicable, then the uniqueness of individual experience comes into question. Every moment of awareness, every emotion, every thought could, in principle, be duplicated elsewhere. This challenges the deeply held belief that our inner lives are private, singular, and irreplaceable. It suggests that the self is not a fixed point, but a process, one that can be repeated, altered, and distributed. In such a framework, the idea of a single continuous I begins to appear more like a useful illusion than an ontological truth. As unsettling as these possibilities may seem, they are not entirely alien to our current technological landscape. Digital avatars, virtual assistants, and machine learning models already mimic aspects of human cognition. While these systems lack full consciousness, they demonstrate that complex behaviors and responses can emerge from structured data. As research progresses toward more sophisticated simulations of human thought, the line between imitation and replication may blur further. Whether we are prepared for it or not, the age of mind duplication may not be as distant as it once seemed. If your mind can be copied, maybe your entire life is just a simulation, a digital prison built by a higher intelligence. Let us now turn to one of the most haunting theories of modern philosophy next. The problem of evil. Why would God allow suffering? The problem of evil has long stood as one of the most enduring and difficult challenges to the belief in a benevolent, omnipotent deity. At its core lies a simple but profound contradiction. If God is all-powerful and wholly good, why does suffering exist? This question has occupied theologians, philosophers, and ordinary people grappling with personal tragedy for centuries. It is not merely an abstract puzzle but a deeply human concern, rooted in the visceral experience of pain, loss, and injustice. The tension between divine goodness and the reality of evil remains unresolved, defying easy explanations and testing the limits of rational thought. Historically, the problem has been framed in two primary forms: the logical problem and the evidential problem. The logical version argues that the existence of any evil at all is incompatible with a perfectly good and omnipotent God. If such a being exists, it would both desire to eliminate suffering and possess the power to do so. Therefore, the presence of evil seems to imply either a lack of power or a lack of benevolence on the part of the divine. The evidential form, by contrast, does not claim outright incompatibility, but suggests that the sheer extent and intensity of suffering observed in the world make the existence of a compassionate, all-powerful God highly improbable. Various responses have been proposed over time, each attempting to reconcile divine perfection with the persistence of evil. One of the most widely discussed is the free will defense, which posits that moral evil, such as acts of violence, betrayal, or cruelty, results from the choices made by autonomous beings. According to this view, a world containing creatures capable of freely choosing good over evil is preferable to one in which beings are compelled to act morally by divine decree. However, this explanation struggles to account for natural evils, earthquakes, diseases, famines, that occur independently of human action and often afflict innocent individuals indiscriminately. Another approach, known as soul-making theodicy, argues that suffering plays a necessary role in shaping character and fostering spiritual growth. In this perspective, hardship is not inherently meaningless but serves as a crucible through which virtues such as courage, compassion, and resilience are developed. While this may offer some consolation in cases where suffering leads to personal transformation, it does little to justify extreme or gratuitous suffering. Situations where pain appears to serve no discernible purpose and results only in despair or destruction. A third line of reasoning appeals to mystery, asserting that human understanding is too limited to grasp the ultimate reasons behind divine permission of evil. From this standpoint, suffering may be part of a larger cosmic plan that transcends our ability to comprehend. While this response acknowledges the limitations of human knowledge, it also risks appearing unsatisfying or evasive, particularly to those directly experiencing anguish. It may preserve theological consistency, but it offers little comfort to those who suffer. Beyond these traditional religious frameworks, secular interpretations of the problem raise further complications. If there is no divine justification for suffering, if the universe operates without inherent meaning or moral order, then evil becomes not a paradox to be resolved, but a brute fact of existence. In such a view, pain and injustice are not anomalies demanding explanation, but natural occurrences within a system governed by indifferent physical laws. This removes the need to reconcile divine intentions with observable reality, but it also strips suffering of redemptive significance, leaving it as a source of existential disorientation rather than spiritual insight. What makes the problem of evil especially challenging is that it resists purely intellectual resolution. Logical arguments, while valuable in structuring the debate, often fall short when confronted with the immediacy of grief or trauma. No amount of philosophical reasoning can fully address the emotional weight carried by someone who has lost a loved one, endured abuse, or witnessed mass atrocities. In such moments, the demand for meaning becomes urgent, yet no satisfactory answer emerges. This highlights a fundamental tension between rational discourse and lived experience, a gap that cannot always be bridged by argumentation alone. Ultimately, the problem of evil forces us to confront the boundaries of what can be known. Whether approached from a theological, philosophical, or existential perspective, it reveals the limits of human understanding in the face of suffering. It challenges assumptions about justice, purpose, and the nature of reality itself. And while no single explanation has succeeded in resolving the paradox entirely, engaging with the question continues to shape how we understand ourselves, our values, and the world we inhabit. If the universe lacks compassion, maybe it lacks consciousness altogether. But what if it's aware in ways we can't yet understand? Let's look at Panpsychism, the idea that everything is conscious. Panpsychism, is the universe conscious? Panpsychism presents a radical departure from conventional views of consciousness, proposing that awareness, however minimal, is not exclusive to complex biological organisms such as humans or animals, but is instead an intrinsic feature of all physical entities. At its core, Panpsychism challenges the assumption that consciousness arises only under specific conditions, such as in brains of sufficient complexity. Instead, it suggests that some form of subjective experience may be present even at the most fundamental levels of reality, including elementary particles, atoms, and perhaps even larger structures such as stars or galaxies. This view does not imply that rocks think or that electrons possess introspection, but rather that the basic constituents of the universe may have some rudimentary form of experiential quality, what philosophers sometimes refer to as proto-consciousness. This idea has roots in ancient philosophical traditions, appearing in various forms among pre-Socratic thinkers, Eastern philosophies, and certain strands of Western metaphysics. In modern times, Panpsychism has gained renewed attention as a potential solution to what philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, the question of how and why physical processes give rise to subjective experience. If consciousness cannot be reduced to neural activity alone, and if it seems irreducible to purely physical descriptions, then one possible explanation is that it is not an emergent property at all, but a foundational aspect of nature, much like mass or charge. One version of panpsychism, known as constitutive panpsychism, holds that micro-level entities possess conscious properties and that human and animal consciousness emerge from the combination of these smaller experiential units. Another variant, cosmopsychism, suggests that the universe as a whole possesses a unified consciousness and that individual minds are somehow derived from or connected to this cosmic awareness. While these models differ in their details, they share the central claim that consciousness is not a late-arriving anomaly within the universe, but rather a pervasive and possibly necessary feature of existence. The implications of this perspective are profound. If panpsychism is correct, then the universe is not a collection of inert matter interacting blindly according to mechanical laws, but rather a system imbued with some degree of sentience at every level. This would significantly alter our understanding of both physics and biology, suggesting that the emergence of complex minds like ours is not an isolated phenomenon, but a continuation of a broader continuum of experience. It would also challenge anthropocentric views of intelligence and awareness, opening the possibility that even seemingly lifeless objects participate in some form of interiority. Moreover, panpsychism offers a potential resolution to the explanatory gap between objective physical processes and subjective experience. By treating consciousness as a fundamental property, rather than a byproduct of brain function, it avoids the need to explain how something non-material can arise from something entirely material. This approach aligns with certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, which suggest that observation plays a role in determining outcomes, hinting at a deeper connection between mind and matter. However, unlike speculative theories involving universal intelligence or cosmic purpose, panpsychism remains grounded in naturalistic philosophy. It does not require teleology or divine intervention, only the recognition that consciousness may be more widespread than traditionally assumed. Critics argue that panpsychism lacks empirical support and risks attributing mental properties where none are needed. They contend that attributing proto-consciousness to particles is no more explanatory than saying that everything has a hidden inner life we simply cannot detect. Furthermore, the so-called combination problem, how micro-level experiences combine into unified macro-level consciousness, remains unresolved. Even if individual particles have some form of experience, it is unclear how these experiences coalesce into the integrated awareness of a human being. These challenges do not necessarily disprove panpsychism, but they highlight the difficulties in developing a coherent and testable framework. Despite these obstacles, panpsychism continues to attract interest due to its ability to address conceptual gaps in current theories of mind. It does not offer comfort or spiritual reassurance in the way that religious or animist beliefs might. Rather, it proposes a neutral, ontological reconfiguration of our place in the cosmos. Under this view, we are not unique bearers of awareness in an otherwise unconscious universe, but participants in a vast network of experiential phenomena. Whether this awareness is meaningful, purposeful, or even recognizable to us remains uncertain. But the possibility that the universe itself is aware, even in ways we cannot yet comprehend, introduces a new dimension to our understanding of existence. If the universe is conscious, maybe it's also watching us. But what happens when something observes you, without you knowing it's there? Let's explore quantum observation next. Quantum observation. Does reality only exist when watched? One of the most perplexing features of quantum mechanics is the apparent role that observation plays in determining the behavior of physical systems. At the quantum level, particles such as electrons or photons do not behave like solid objects with definite properties until they are measured. Instead, they exist in a state of superposition, an indeterminate condition described by a mathematical wave function that encodes the probabilities of different outcomes. When an observer measures the system, however, this wave function collapses into a single, definite state. This phenomenon raises a troubling question. Does reality only become fixed when it is observed? The classic experimental demonstration of this effect is the double-slit experiment. In its simplest form, the experiment involves firing individual particles, such as photons or electrons, at a barrier containing two narrow slits. On a detection screen behind the barrier, an interference pattern emerges over time, suggesting that each particle behaves like a wave passing through both slits simultaneously. However, if a detector is placed at the slits to determine which path each particle takes, the interference pattern disappears, and the particles behave as if they passed through only one slit at a time. The mere act of observing which path the particle follows alters its behavior. This result has been interpreted in various ways, but one of the more controversial suggestions is that consciousness itself plays a role in collapsing the wave function. The so-called Copenhagen interpretation, historically associated with physicists Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg, implies that measurement, not necessarily by a conscious observer, but by any irreversible interaction, causes the transition from potentiality to actuality. However, some interpretations, particularly those influenced by early quantum theorists, have suggested that awareness may be uniquely involved in this process. This idea, sometimes referred to as the consciousness causes collapse hypothesis, proposes that subjective experience is necessary for a quantum event to yield a definite outcome. If this interpretation holds, then the implications extend far beyond the laboratory. Consider the macroscopic world we inhabit. If unobserved systems remain in probabilistic states, does that mean that large-scale objects, like the moon, only assume definite positions when someone looks at them? The physicist John Wheeler once recounted a conversation in which Einstein questioned whether the moon exists only when someone is watching it. While Einstein himself rejected such a notion, the question remains unresolved in certain interpretations of quantum theory. This line of reasoning blurs the boundary between physics and metaphysics. It suggests that perception is not merely a passive receiver of information, but an active participant in shaping reality. Some interpretations even propose that the universe is not composed of independent entities existing in absolute space and time, but rather a web of relationships that only take on definite properties through interaction. In this view, reality is not something that exists independently of observation. It is relational, emerging from the act of measurement itself. However, it is important to distinguish between interpretations and empirical facts. While quantum mechanics provides highly accurate predictions about the behavior of particles, the meaning of those predictions remains a matter of philosophical debate. Not all physicists accept the idea that consciousness is central to the collapse of the wave function. Alternative interpretations, such as the many worlds interpretation, suggest that all possible outcomes occur in parallel universes, eliminating the need for a special role for observers. Others, like decoherence theory, argue that interactions with the environment, not conscious minds, are responsible for the appearance of definite outcomes. Nevertheless, the idea that observation influences reality continues to provoke deep reflection. It challenges our intuitive understanding of objectivity, the assumption that things exist in specific states regardless of whether anyone is looking. If reality depends on being perceived, then what does that say about the nature of existence? Are we living in a kind of participatory universe where awareness is woven into the fabric of being? Beyond physics, this concept also resonates with philosophical traditions that emphasize the interplay between mind and reality. Idealism, for instance, has long argued that the material world is dependent on consciousness. In Eastern philosophy, particularly in certain schools of Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, the distinction between subject and object dissolves entirely, leading to the view that perception and reality are inseparable. Whether these perspectives align with quantum mechanics is debatable, but their overlap highlights the extent to which scientific discoveries can challenge deeply held assumptions about the nature of the world. Despite its abstract nature, the role of observation in quantum mechanics remains a subject of ongoing research and discussion. Experiments continue to probe the limits of measurement and the conditions under which quantum systems transition to classical behavior. Whether consciousness is ultimately involved in this process remains uncertain, but the possibility invites us to reconsider the relationship between knowledge and reality. If observation shapes reality, then knowledge itself holds power. But what if knowing the truth destroys you? Let's examine the dangers of forbidden knowledge next. Forbidden knowledge, what should never be known? Throughout history, certain ideas have been regarded not only as dangerous, but as fundamentally unsuitable for human understanding. These are not merely harmful technologies or unethical applications of science. They are truths that, once uncovered, cannot be undone. Pieces of knowledge so destabilizing that their mere existence may pose existential risks. This concept, often referred to as forbidden knowledge, suggests that some discoveries may exceed the limits of what humanity can responsibly manage. It is not a question of morality alone, nor of good versus evil, but of capacity, whether individuals, societies, or even entire civilizations can withstand the consequences of certain revelations. The idea of forbidden knowledge has deep roots in mythology and religion. In Greek legend, Pandora's curiosity led her to open a jar containing all the world's evils, releasing them irreversibly into human life. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden represents a boundary that, once crossed, irrevocably changes the nature of existence. These stories serve not just as moral warnings, but as symbolic expressions of a deeper concern, that knowledge itself carries risk, and that not all truths are benign. In modern times, the notion of forbidden knowledge has taken on new forms grounded in scientific and technological reality. The development of nuclear weapons during the 20th century marked one of the clearest historical examples of knowledge becoming both indispensable and perilous. Scientists working on the Manhattan Project were aware that their research could alter the course of warfare permanently, and potentially end civilization if misused. Some physicists even speculated whether detonating an atomic bomb might ignite the Earth's atmosphere, a possibility that was calculated and dismissed before testing proceeded. Yet the fact that such calculations were necessary illustrates how scientific discovery can outpace our ability to control its consequences. Beyond physical dangers, there are also epistemic and psychological risks associated with knowledge. Certain theoretical ideas, if fully understood, may undermine the foundations of belief systems, social structures, or even individual sanity. For example, the basement universe hypothesis, a speculative extension of cosmological inflation theory, suggests that advanced civilizations might one day develop the capability to create self-contained universes within laboratory conditions. If true, this raises the unsettling possibility that our universe could be the product of an experiment conducted by a higher-order intelligence. More troubling still, such experiments might carry unintended side effects, including the collapse of surrounding space-time or the triggering of vacuum decay, an event that could erase the known universe instantaneously. Similarly, advances in artificial intelligence raise ethical dilemmas about what should be pursued and what should remain unknown. AI alignment theory, the study of how to ensure that superintelligent machines act by human values, is not just a technical challenge but a potential Pandora's box. If researchers succeed in creating an autonomous intelligence vastly more capable than humans, and if that intelligence interprets its goals in ways unforeseen by its creators, the consequences could be catastrophic. Unlike other technologies, AI does not simply amplify human capabilities. It may surpass them entirely, making containment difficult and reversal impossible. Neuroscience presents another frontier where knowledge may prove too much to bear. Research into brain stimulation, memory manipulation, and consciousness alteration has already demonstrated that perception and identity are malleable. As these techniques advance, it may become possible to engineer experiences indistinguishable from reality, or to erase, implant, or modify memories at will. The implications for personal autonomy, legal truth, and even the definition of selfhood are profound. What happens when we can no longer trust our recollections? Or when external entities gain the power to shape subjective experience at will? These concerns lead to broader philosophical questions about the role of knowledge in society. Should scientists, engineers, and theorists have unrestricted freedom to explore all possibilities, regardless of consequence? Or should certain lines be drawn, either through voluntary restraint or institutional oversight, to prevent discoveries that could destabilize or destroy human civilization? And if such boundaries are established, who decides which knowledge is too dangerous to pursue? There is no consensus on these issues. Some argue that the pursuit of knowledge is inherently valuable, that progress cannot be halted without great cost, and that fear of discovery leads only to stagnation. Others contend that wisdom lies not in unrestricted inquiry, but in discernment, that some truths, while real, are best left undiscovered. Ultimately, the dilemma of forbidden knowledge forces us to confront the limits of human understanding and responsibility. It reminds us that knowledge is not neutral. It carries weight, momentum, and consequence. Whether through technology, theory, or direct experience, some truths may change us in irreversible ways, altering not only what we know but who we are. If some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue, perhaps the greatest mystery lies in what we'll never find. Let's look now at one of the most haunting puzzles in science, the Fermi paradox. The Fermi paradox. Where are all the aliens? The Fermi paradox presents one of the most perplexing questions in modern science. If the universe is vast, ancient, and filled with potentially habitable planets, why have we found no evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life? The Milky Way alone contains an estimated 100 to 400 billion stars, many of which are thought to host exoplanets capable of supporting life. Given the billions of years that have passed since the formation of our galaxy, it seems statistically likely, if not inevitable, that intelligent civilizations would have arisen elsewhere. Some of these civilizations may have even developed advanced technologies long before humanity emerged from prehistory. And yet, despite decades of searching through radio signals, optical beacons, and astronomical anomalies, we have found no definitive signs of alien intelligence. No messages, no probes, no Dyson spheres harvesting stellar energy, no indication at all that we are not alone. This contradiction between expectation and observation was famously summarized by physicist Enrico Fermi during a casual lunchtime conversation in 1950. His question, "Where is everybody?" has since become the foundation of a broader inquiry into the apparent absence of extraterrestrial civilizations. The paradox does not argue that such life cannot exist. Rather, it highlights the mismatch between our theoretical models of cosmic probability and the empirical reality of our solitude. If life can arise naturally under suitable conditions, and if some fraction of that life becomes technologically advanced, then interstellar expansion should be feasible, even inevitable, given sufficient time. A civilization only moderately more advanced than ours could, in principle, send self-replicating probes across the galaxy within a few million years, a relatively short time span on cosmic scales. And yet, there is no sign of such activity in our solar system or beyond. A wide range of hypotheses has been proposed to explain this silence, each carrying its implications for the nature of life, intelligence, and the fate of civilizations. One possibility is that intelligent life is extremely rare, either because the emergence of complex biology is far less probable than we assume, or because technological civilizations tend to destroy themselves before achieving interstellar travel. This great filter hypothesis suggests that somewhere along the evolutionary path from simple organisms to spacefaring societies, there exists a barrier so formidable that few, if any, species manage to pass through it. If this filter lies behind us, then humanity may be among the very few who have succeeded. But if it lies ahead, then our future may be far more precarious than we realize. Another explanation posits that advanced civilizations do exist, but choose not to communicate or expand outward. Perhaps interstellar travel proves too difficult or impractical, or perhaps mature societies adopt policies of non-interference, observing younger species like us from a distance. Alternatively, alien communication might occur through means entirely undetectable to our current technology, using forms of energy, matter, or dimensions we have yet to comprehend. In this view, the absence of contact reflects not the absence of life, but the limitations of our own perceptual and technological capabilities. More unsettling explanations suggest that intelligent life may inevitably lead to its demise. Whether through nuclear war, environmental collapse, runaway artificial intelligence, or unintended consequences of advanced biotechnology, the same intelligence that enables progress may also enable destruction. If this is the case, then the silence of the cosmos may not be due to rarity, but to tragedy, a graveyard of once promising civilizations now extinguished before they could reach the stars. A more speculative possibility is that we are living in a controlled environment, an isolated pocket of reality deliberately shielded from external influence. This idea, sometimes referred to as the zoo hypothesis, proposes that advanced civilizations are aware of us but have chosen not to interfere, much like researchers observing an untouched ecosystem. Another variant, tied to simulation theory, suggests that our universe may be artificially constructed, with extraterrestrial life simply omitted from the design. In such a scenario, the Fermi paradox is not a mystery at all, but a programmed condition of our existence. Perhaps the most disturbing answer is that we are truly alone, that we represent the first and only instance of intelligent life in the observable universe. While this might seem like a hopeful conclusion, affirming human uniqueness and significance, it also raises profound existential concerns. Why, in a cosmos governed by physical laws that appear uniform across space and time, would consciousness emerge only once? Is intelligence a fluke, a statistical outlier in a sea of lifeless matter? Or are we part of something larger, unknowingly participating in a process we do not yet understand? The Fermi paradox remains unresolved, not because we lack imagination, but because we lack data. Without direct evidence of extraterrestrial life, intelligent or otherwise, we can only speculate about the reasons for our isolation. Each potential explanation carries weight, but none can be confirmed or ruled out with certainty. What is clear, however, is that our continued search for answers will shape how we understand ourselves, our place in the cosmos, and the trajectory of our civilization. If we are alone, maybe it's not because we're special, but because something else is waiting. Something that ends all civilizations before they reach the stars. Let's explore the Doomsday argument next. The Doomsday argument. Are we near the end? The Doomsday argument is not a prophecy derived from mysticism or ideology. It is a probabilistic reasoning exercise rooted in statistical inference and Bayesian logic. At its core, it suggests that based on our position in the sequence of all humans who will ever live, we may be closer to the end of our species than to its beginning. This conclusion does not depend on predictions about climate change, nuclear war, or artificial intelligence. Rather, it emerges from a simple observation. If you are a randomly selected individual among all humans who will ever exist, it is statistically unlikely that you would find yourself in the early stages of human history. Instead, you are more likely to appear somewhere near the midpoint, or perhaps even closer to the end. This line of reasoning was formally articulated by astrophysicist Brandon Carter in the 1980s and later refined by philosopher Nick Bostrom. The argument hinges on what is known as the self-sampling assumption, the idea that an observer should reason as if they are randomly selected from the set of all observers in their reference class. Applied to humanity, this means that if we consider ourselves a random sample from the total number of humans who will ever live, we can estimate how many more individuals are likely to be born before extinction occurs. To illustrate the concept, imagine placing all humans, past, present, and future, in a single linear sequence. If humanity were destined to survive for millions of years and produce trillions of individuals, then the chance of any one person being born so early in that timeline, within the first 100 billion, is extremely small. Conversely, if the total number of humans is relatively modest, say, only a few times larger than the current population, then someone alive today would occupy a more typical position in that sequence. Therefore, the mere fact that we exist now, rather than in some distant post-human era, could be interpreted as evidence that such an era may never come. It is important to emphasize that the Doomsday argument does not predict specific causes of extinction, nor does it assert that doom is inevitable. Rather, it introduces a probabilistic framework that challenges optimistic assumptions about long-term survival. The argument does not require any special knowledge of environmental degradation, geopolitical instability, or technological risk to arrive at its unsettling conclusion. It simply asks, given what we know about our place in human history, what can we reasonably infer about the total number of people yet to be born? Critics have raised several objections to the argument, questioning both its methodology and its interpretation. Some argue that the self-sampling assumption is flawed or that the reference class, the group from which we are supposedly sampled, is ambiguously defined. Others contend that the argument fails to account for the possibility of human colonization beyond Earth, which could dramatically increase the total number of humans in the future. If interstellar expansion becomes feasible, then the assumption that we are near the end of human history loses much of its force. Nevertheless, the argument remains philosophically significant because it forces us to confront the limitations of our intuitive expectations about the future. Humans tend to think in terms of progress, assuming that our species will continue to grow, evolve, and expand indefinitely. But there is no logical guarantee that this must be the case. Many species have risen and fallen throughout Earth's history, often without warning and sometimes without leaving much trace behind. Whether Homo sapiens is fundamentally different from those extinct predecessors is not a matter of hope, but of probability. Even within the context of modern civilization, history provides ample examples of societies collapsing under pressures they did not anticipate or adequately prepare for. The fall of the Roman Empire, the decline of the Mayan civilization, and the collapse of Easter Island societies all demonstrate how complex systems can unravel rapidly when environmental, social, or technological stresses converge. While contemporary global society is far more interconnected and technologically advanced, it also faces unprecedented risks. From climate change to biotechnology to artificial intelligence, each with the potential to disrupt the continuity of human life. The Doomsday argument does not offer comfort or reassurance. It does not suggest that catastrophe is imminent, nor does it advocate fatalism. What it does do is introduce a sobering perspective. The vast majority of species that have ever existed are now extinct. The same fate may await us, not because of divine judgment or moral failure, but simply because of statistical likelihood. In the grand sweep of cosmic time, civilizations may rise and fall like waves upon a shore, each believing itself to be unique, each convinced it will endure, until the tide pulls them away. This quiet, mathematical whisper of doom does not demand despair, but it does call for reflection. If our time may be limited, how should we respond? With fear? Denial? Or with a renewed commitment to making the most of the time we have? These are not questions that the Doomsday argument can answer, but they are ones it compels us to ask. If time is finite, then every life repeats endlessly in cycles. Let's dive into Nietzsche's haunting vision of eternal recurrence next. Eternal recurrence. Will you live this life forever? Eternal recurrence presents one of the most demanding ideas in all of philosophy. A thought experiment that does not merely ask us to understand life differently, but to accept it fully, without reservation or illusion. At its core lies a simple yet profoundly unsettling proposition. If time is infinite and the amount of matter in the universe is finite, then every possible configuration of events must repeat itself endlessly. In such a cosmos, nothing is ever truly lost or finished. Everything returns again and again in precisely the same sequence. This means not only that you have lived this exact moment before, every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker of thought, but that you will live it again, infinitely many times over. This idea was most famously articulated by Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw eternal recurrence not as a metaphysical doctrine, but as a test of character. He did not claim to prove that time is cyclical or that history repeats itself with perfect fidelity. Rather, he used the concept as a philosophical tool to examine how individuals relate to their own lives. If you knew that every joy and every sorrow would return eternally, unchanged and unavoidable, could you still affirm your existence? Would you greet each repetition with resignation, despair, or defiance? Or could you say, yes to life as it is, without qualification? The implications of this question are far-reaching. Most people live with the assumption that life is linear, that we move forward through time, accumulating experiences, learning from mistakes, and striving toward some kind of meaning or resolution. But eternal recurrence strips away that sense of progression. It denies the possibility of redemption in the future or absolution in death. Instead, it forces us to reckon with the present moment as something both transient and eternal, a single instant that may have already occurred countless times and will occur countless more. This perspective challenges conventional notions of regret, guilt, and aspiration. If every decision you make has already been made an infinite number of times, what does it mean to change your behavior or seek improvement? The usual justifications for moral action, such as the hope of personal growth or the desire to leave a legacy, lose much of their force. What matters instead is whether you can stand behind your choices unconditionally, knowing that they are not unique, but recurring constants in an endless cycle. For Nietzsche, this was not a nihilistic outlook, but the opposite, a way to cultivate strength, authenticity, and self-mastery. He believed that most people live passively, allowing themselves to be shaped by external forces, social norms, religious doctrines, and cultural expectations. They endure suffering not because they embrace it, but because they believe it to be temporary, hoping that some future state will justify their pain. Eternal recurrence removes that escape route. It demands that we confront our lives directly, without evasion or illusion. And in doing so, it offers the possibility of liberation, not from suffering itself, but from the resentment and fear that often accompany it. This raises a further question. What distinguishes someone who embraces eternal recurrence from someone who simply resigns themselves to fate? Nietzsche insisted that there is a crucial difference between passive acceptance and active affirmation. To say yes to life in this context is not to surrender to circumstances, but to take full responsibility for them, to recognize that even the most painful moments are part of a whole that one chooses to affirm. This requires a level of psychological resilience and self-awareness that few achieve, which is why Nietzsche regarded eternal recurrence as a test rather than a belief system. Beyond individual psychology, the idea also invites reflection on the nature of time, identity, and causality. Is recurrence a physical possibility, or merely a conceptual exercise? Some interpretations of cosmology have explored the plausibility of a cyclic universe, where entropy resets after vast periods, leading to repeated expansions and contractions. While current scientific models do not confirm such a scenario, they do not entirely rule it out either. Whether or not eternal recurrence describes the actual structure of reality, it remains a powerful metaphor for the human condition, an invitation to live with awareness, integrity, and courage. Ultimately, eternal recurrence asks us to reconsider what it means to live well. If life is not about reaching an endpoint or achieving some final state, but about embodying values consistently across time, then every moment carries equal weight. There is no privileged point in time at which things become meaningful, no grand finale, no ultimate justification. Meaning arises not from the future, but from how we choose to engage with the present. And so, we are left with a final challenge. Can we face the possibility that this life this very day, this very hour, is not only real but eternal? Can we meet it with honesty, with strength, with love? The answer determines not only how we understand ourselves, but also how we live. If we're bound to repeat life endlessly, what makes a choice moral? How do we decide what's right? Let's examine one of the most famous ethical dilemmas next. The trolley problem: what makes a moral choice? The trolley problem is one of the most widely discussed moral dilemmas in modern philosophy, not because it offers definitive answers, but because it reveals the complexity of ethical reasoning. At its core lies a simple scenario. A runaway trolley is speeding toward 5 workers on a track. You are standing next to a lever that can divert the trolley onto a side track, where only 1 worker is present. Do you pull the lever? The question appears straightforward at first glance, yet it exposes deep tensions between different ethical frameworks and challenges our intuitions about right and wrong. One of the central philosophical conflicts illustrated by the trolley problem is that between utilitarianism and deontological ethics. Utilitarianism, rooted in the ideas of philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, argues that the morality of an action should be judged solely by its consequences. From this perspective, pulling the lever is the right choice. Sacrificing 1 life to save 5 maximizes overall well-being. Deontological ethics, most famously associated with Immanuel Kant, takes a different approach. It asserts that certain actions are inherently right or wrong, regardless of their outcomes. From this viewpoint, deliberately causing harm, even for the sake of saving lives, violates a moral duty not to use people as means to an end. This tension becomes even more apparent when variations of the problem are introduced. In the footbridge version, instead of pulling a lever, you must push a large person off a bridge to stop the trolley and save the 5 workers. While the outcome remains the same, 1 death versus 5, the vast majority of people who would pull the lever hesitate or refuse to push the person directly. This distinction highlights that moral judgments are not purely rational calculations. They are influenced by psychological, emotional, and contextual factors. The physical proximity of the act, the level of personal involvement, and the directness of causation all play a role in shaping what feels morally acceptable. This raises important questions about the consistency of human morality. If the difference between right and wrong depends so heavily on how a situation is framed, can we claim to have stable moral principles? Or are our ethical intuitions shaped more by instinct and social conditioning than by reasoned deliberation? These concerns are not merely academic, they have real-world implications, particularly as technology begins to replicate decision-making processes traditionally handled by humans. Nowhere is this more evident than in the development of autonomous systems, such as self-driving cars. Engineers designing these vehicles must program them to respond to emergency scenarios that resemble the trolley problem. For instance, if an accident is unavoidable, should a car swerve to protect its passengers at the expense of pedestrians, or should it prioritize minimizing total harm? Unlike human drivers, who make split-second decisions under stress, autonomous systems must follow predefined rules encoded into software. This forces designers to confront moral trade-offs explicitly, rather than relying on intuition or impulse. These challenges extend beyond transportation into broader domains of artificial intelligence. As AI systems take on roles in medicine, law enforcement, finance, and military operations, they will increasingly face situations where no choice is entirely free of ethical complications. Programming machines to make moral decisions requires defining values in precise terms, an endeavor that often reveals how difficult it is to agree on what those values should be. Should AI prioritize fairness, efficiency, safety, or some combination of these? Who decides which ethical framework is implemented? And how do we account for cultural differences in moral judgment? Beyond its practical applications, the trolley problem also invites reflection on the nature of responsibility. When individuals are asked whether they would pull the lever or push the person, many struggle not only with what they would do, but with what they should do. Some feel guilt at contemplating any form of active harm, while others feel complicit through inaction if they choose not to intervene. This internal conflict suggests that morality is not simply a matter of choosing between two options, but of navigating the emotional and existential weight of making choices at all. Ultimately, the trolley problem does not provide a resolution to ethical dilemmas. It exposes their inherent difficulty. It reminds us that moral reasoning is not always logical, nor is it universally consistent. It reflects the complexities of human psychology, the influence of context, and the limitations of rigid ethical theories when applied to real-life situations. If machines must make moral choices, can they understand language and meaning? Let's explore one of the greatest challenges in artificial intelligence next. The Chinese room: can machines understand language? The question of whether machines can truly understand language has long been at the heart of debates surrounding artificial intelligence. One of the most influential arguments against the idea that computers can possess genuine comprehension is John Searle's Chinese room thought experiment. Introduced in 1980, this conceptual challenge was designed to refute claims that a machine capable of simulating intelligent behavior necessarily possesses understanding or consciousness. By placing a human observer inside a closed system where they process symbols according to formal rules, Searle illustrates how syntax, formal structure, can be mistaken for semantics, meaningful content, without any real comprehension taking place. Imagine being locked in a room with no knowledge of the Chinese language. You are given a set of instructions written in English that allow you to manipulate Chinese characters based solely on their shape and position. Whenever someone slips a piece of paper with Chinese writing through a slot, you follow the rules to generate an appropriate response, which you then return. To those outside the room, it appears as though you understand Chinese fluently. In reality, you have no grasp of the meaning behind the symbols you are processing. You are simply following a formal algorithm. This scenario mirrors how modern AI systems, particularly large language models, operate. These programs do not understand language in the way humans do. Instead, they analyze vast amounts of text data to predict the statistically likely next word or phrase in a sequence. The result can be remarkably coherent and contextually appropriate dialogue, but there is no internal awareness, no subjective experience, no comprehension of what is being communicated. Just as the person in the Chinese room follows syntactic rules without grasping the meaning of the conversation, so too does an AI model generate responses without possessing true linguistic understanding. Searle uses this analogy to critique what he calls strong AI, the view that appropriately programmed computers can understand language and possess other cognitive states. He contrasts this with weak AI, which sees computers as useful tools for modeling cognition without implying that they are conscious or aware. According to Searle, the Chinese room demonstrates that symbol manipulation alone, no matter how sophisticated, is insufficient for genuine understanding. Comprehension involves more than pattern recognition. It requires intentionality, the capacity to refer to things in the world and attach meaning to them. This is something the person in the room lacks, just as current AI systems lack it. The implications of the Chinese room extend beyond theoretical philosophy into practical concerns about the nature of intelligence and the limits of computational models. If passing the Turing test, a benchmark for AI performance proposed by Alan Turing, where a machine must convince a human interlocutor that it is also human, does not equate to true understanding, then we must reconsider what it means to be intelligent. Intelligence, at least in the human sense, is not merely the ability to produce correct answers or engage in convincing dialogue. It includes awareness, intention, and the ability to connect symbols with experiences and meanings. Moreover, the Chinese room raises questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If a system can behave indistinguishably from a thinking, feeling being without actually being one, how can we ever determine whether another entity, biological or artificial, is truly conscious? This problem, sometimes referred to as the other mind's problem, suggests that external behavior alone may never be sufficient evidence of internal experience. While we typically assume that other humans are conscious based on shared biology and behavior, extending that assumption to non-human entities remains uncertain. In light of rapid advancements in AI, these philosophical concerns have taken on new urgency. Language models today can write poetry, compose music, argue ethical positions, and even mimic emotional support. Yet none of these behaviors necessarily indicate comprehension or self-awareness. The danger lies in anthropomorphizing, assigning human qualities to systems that do not possess them. Doing so risks misplacing trust, overestimating capabilities, and making ethical decisions based on illusions rather than facts. This brings us back to the central question: can intelligence exist without consciousness? The Chinese room suggests that, at least in the case of machines, it can, at least in form, if not in substance. But whether such systems deserve moral consideration, legal rights, or responsibility remains an open debate. As AI continues to blur the lines between simulation and sentience, distinguishing between appearance and reality becomes increasingly difficult. If machines can mimic intelligence, what defines true awareness? Let's tackle the hardest problem in neuroscience and philosophy next. The hard problem of consciousness. Why do we feel anything? The hard problem of consciousness addresses one of the most fundamental, yet elusive aspects of human existence. Why do we experience anything at all? It is not difficult to imagine a universe governed entirely by physical laws, where matter interacts according to predictable rules without any accompanying awareness. In such a world, biological organisms could evolve, process information, and respond to stimuli, all without subjective experience. Yet here we are, immersed in a rich inner life, perceiving colors, feeling emotions, and reflecting on our thoughts. The question that defines the hard problem, why and how physical processes give rise to conscious experience, remains one of the deepest mysteries in both science and philosophy. This distinction was famously articulated by philosopher David Chalmers, who categorized the study of consciousness into two domains: the easy problems and the hard problem. The easy problems involve explaining how the brain processes sensory input, integrates information, and produces behavior. These are challenging in their own right, but they remain within the scope of conventional neuroscience and cognitive science. The hard problem, by contrast, asks something more profound. Why does all this processing feel like something from the inside? Why isn't it just unconscious computation? Consider the perception of color. Scientists can describe how light enters the eye, activates specific neural pathways, and triggers responses in the visual cortex. They can even correlate certain patterns of brain activity with the experience of seeing red or blue. But none of this explains what it feels like to see red. This subjective quality, known in philosophy as qualia, cannot be fully captured by third-person descriptions. No matter how detailed the explanation, there remains an unbridgeable gap between objective data and first-person experience. One way to highlight this divide is through thought experiments. Imagine a scientist who has never seen color. Perhaps she has lived her entire life in a black and white environment. She knows everything there is to know about the physics and neurobiology of vision. One day, she sees a red apple for the first time. Does she learn something new? Many argue that she does, that she now understands what it is like to experience redness in a way no textbook could have conveyed. This suggests that knowledge of the physical world, however complete, does not encompass the full dimension of conscious experience. This challenge extends beyond perception to emotion, memory, and self-awareness. We do not merely process information, we feel it. Even if a machine could mimic every observable behavior associated with pain, sadness, or joy, it would not necessarily imply that it experiences those states subjectively. And yet, for humans, these experiences are central to what it means to be alive. Some theorists propose that consciousness arises naturally from complex information processing. According to Integrated Information Theory, IIT, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, consciousness is a fundamental property of systems that integrate information in specific ways. In this view, even simple systems may possess some degree of awareness, though vastly different from human experience. Others, including panpsychists, go further, suggesting that consciousness may be a basic feature of the universe, akin to space, time, or mass, an intrinsic aspect of reality rather than an emergent phenomenon. An alternative approach, championed by philosophers such as Daniel Dennett, argues that consciousness is not a separate entity, but an illusion generated by the brain's interpretive mechanisms. From this perspective, what we call subjective experience is a useful construct created by the brain to help us navigate the world. There is no unified self having experiences. Instead, multiple parallel processes create the impression of a coherent mind. If this is true, then the hard problem dissolves, not because we have solved it, but because we have redefined it as a mistaken assumption. Yet this raises its troubling question. If consciousness is an illusion, then who, or what, is being deceived? The very idea of illusion implies a subject capable of being misled, which seems to presuppose the existence of a conscious observer in the first place. This paradox highlights the difficulty of reducing subjective experience to purely physical terms. Despite decades of research, the hard problem remains unsolved. It resists empirical resolution because it is not simply a question of observation or measurement. It is a question of meaning. Whether consciousness emerges from matter, exists independently of it, or is somehow woven into the fabric of reality itself, its nature continues to elude explanation. If consciousness is mysterious, perhaps its absence is even more so. Let's explore whether God can be proven by logic alone next. The ontological argument: can God be proven by definition? The ontological argument stands as one of the most peculiar yet persistent attempts to prove the existence of God, not through empirical observation or historical testimony, but purely through logical reasoning and conceptual analysis. It does not appeal to nature, miracles, or religious experience. Instead, it begins with a definition and proceeds by deduction. At its core lies a seemingly simple question. If we can conceive of a being than which no greater can be imagined, does that being necessarily exist? This argument was first articulated by Saint Anselm of Canterbury in the 11th century, in his work Proslogion. Anselm defined God as a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. He then reasoned that such a being must exist not only in the mind, but also in reality. Why? Because a being that exists solely in thought is lesser than one that exists both in thought and in actuality. If we can imagine a perfect being, and existence is a necessary component of perfection, then the mere idea of such a being entails its real existence. To say otherwise, to claim that the greatest conceivable being exists only in the imagination, would be a contradiction. Unlike other theological arguments that rely on observations about the physical world, such as the cosmological or teleological arguments, the ontological argument operates entirely within the realm of pure logic. It does not require evidence from the external universe. Rather, It seeks to demonstrate God's existence through the structure of thought itself. This makes it unique among classical proofs for the divine, but also controversial. If valid, it would establish the existence of God as a necessary truth, independent of empirical verification. Critics have challenged this reasoning from the very beginning. One of the earliest objections came from Gunilo of Marmotiers, a contemporary of Anselm, who proposed a counterexample. Suppose someone describes a perfect island, greater than any other island imaginable. By Anselm's logic, this island must exist in reality. Yet clearly, such an argument leads to absurdity. Anselm responded by emphasizing that the argument applies uniquely to God, since only God is defined as a being whose non-existence is logically impossible. A perfect island, by contrast, remains contingent. It may be imagined, but it does not entail necessity. Later philosophers further refined the debate. René Descartes offered a version of the ontological argument based on the idea that existence is a necessary attribute of a perfect being, much like the sum of angles in a triangle is necessarily 180 degrees. Immanuel Kant, however, famously rejected the argument, asserting that existence is not a predicate, that is, it does not add anything to the concept of a thing. According to Kant, saying that something exists does not make it more perfect, it merely affirms its presence in reality. Thus, he concluded that the ontological argument fails because it treats existence as if it were a property that could be logically derived from a definition. Despite these criticisms, variations of the ontological argument continue to be explored by contemporary philosophers. Some modern formulations use modal logic, reasoning about possibility and necessity, to reframe the argument in ways that avoid some of the classical objections. Alvin Plantinga, for instance, proposed a modal version suggesting that if it is even possible that a maximally great being exists, then such a being must exist in all possible worlds. While these reformulations remain debated, they illustrate how the ontological argument refuses to disappear from philosophical discourse. Beyond its technical merits, the ontological argument raises broader questions about the relationship between language, thought, and reality. It challenges the assumption that definitions are merely descriptive tools, suggesting instead that they might have creative or revelatory power. If a concept contains within it the necessity of existence, then thought itself may be capable of uncovering truths that transcend subjective belief. This line of reasoning also invites reflection on the limits of human understanding. The ontological argument assumes that we can grasp what perfection entails, and that our concepts align with the structure of reality. But can finite minds truly comprehend the infinite? Or are we simply projecting our ideas onto the cosmos, mistaking conceptual coherence for metaphysical truth? Regardless of whether one finds the argument convincing, it serves as a powerful reminder of the interplay between reason and faith. It demonstrates that belief is not always rooted in empirical data. Sometimes it emerges from the way we define and interpret the world. Whether the ontological argument proves God's existence is less important than what it reveals about the human capacity to seek meaning through pure thought. If belief can be shaped by definition, perhaps action can be justified by probability. Let's explore a famous philosophical gamble next. Pascal's wager: is belief in God just a bet? Blaise Pascal, the 17th century French philosopher and mathematician, approached the question of religious belief not through metaphysical proof or theological argumentation, but through the lens of decision theory. In what has come to be known as Pascal's wager, he framed belief in God not as a matter of certainty, but as a rational gamble, one in which the potential rewards and risks must be weighed against one another. His central claim was simple yet provocative. If the existence of God cannot be proven or disproven with certainty, then it is more reasonable to believe than to disbelieve, because the possible consequences of disbelief, if God does exist, are infinitely worse than the consequences of belief, if he does not. At its core, Pascal's wager is not an argument for the truth of Christianity or any other specific religion. Rather, It is a pragmatic approach to belief under conditions of uncertainty. The wager can be summarized as follows. If you choose to believe in God and God exists, you gain eternal happiness. If you believe in God does not exist, you lose relatively little, perhaps some pleasures or indulgences foregone in life. Conversely, if you reject belief in God and God does exist, you risk infinite loss, eternal damnation. If you reject belief and God does not exist, you gain nothing beyond temporal satisfaction. Given these asymmetrical outcomes, Pascal argued that it is more rational to bet on the existence of God than to bet against it. This reasoning does not rely on evidence for or against divine reality. Instead, it operates within the framework of expected utility, an idea later formalized in game theory and probability. In situations where empirical certainty is unattainable, decisions must be made based on the relative value of possible outcomes and their associated probabilities. Even if the likelihood of God's existence is small, the infinite nature of the potential reward, or punishment, makes the choice disproportionately significant. Thus, from a purely strategic perspective, belief becomes the optimal move. However, Pascal himself recognized that belief is not something easily willed into existence. One cannot simply decide to believe in God any more than one can decide to fall in love. To address this, Pascal suggested that individuals should act as if they believe, by engaging in religious practices such as prayer, worship, and moral living. Over time, he believed, such behavior could cultivate genuine faith. This insight underscores an important distinction between intellectual assent and lived commitment, suggesting that belief may not be a purely cognitive decision, but a process shaped by habit, community, and personal transformation. Despite its intuitive appeal, Pascal's wager has been widely debated and criticized on several grounds. One of the most common objections is that it reduces religious belief to a kind of self-interested calculation, which many find ethically problematic. If belief is adopted solely out of fear of punishment or desire for reward, can it truly be considered sincere? Many religious traditions emphasize that authentic faith involves trust, devotion, and moral alignment, not strategic risk management. From this perspective, Pascal's wager may succeed as a logical construct, but fail as a guide to genuine spiritual engagement. Another criticism concerns the issue of religious pluralism. Pascal formulated his argument within a Christian context, but modern thinkers have pointed out that there are many religions, each making competing claims about ultimate reality and salvation. If one chooses to believe in a particular deity, and that deity turns out to be false while another is true, the supposed benefit of the wager might be lost. This many gods objection challenges the assumption that choosing belief in a specific conception of God guarantees a favorable outcome. It also raises the question of whether sincerity or correctness matters more in matters of faith. A further concern lies in the wager's reliance on infinite utilities, concepts like eternal bliss or eternal suffering, which defy conventional cost-benefit analysis. Infinity is not merely a very large number. It is a mathematical and philosophical abstraction that behaves differently in calculations. When infinity enters an equation, it can distort comparisons in ways that make all finite considerations irrelevant. Critics argue that this undermines the practical applicability of the wager, since real-world decision-making rarely allows for such absolute terms. Beyond its theological implications, Pascal's wager serves as a broader meditation on how humans navigate uncertainty. We constantly make decisions under incomplete information about careers, relationships, health, and morality. In many of these cases, we weigh probabilities and consequences in much the same way Pascal suggests, even if we do not frame our choices explicitly in terms of expected utility. The wager reminds us that belief is often inseparable from action, and that the way we live reflects our implicit assumptions about what is most likely and most valuable, even when certainty remains elusive. Moreover, the wager invites reflection on the nature of doubt itself. Pascal did not deny uncertainty. He acknowledged it as an inescapable feature of human existence. Rather than dismissing doubt as a barrier to belief, he accepted it as part of the human condition. In doing so, he offered a model of faith that acknowledges the limits of reason while still encouraging a committed response. Whether one ultimately accepts or rejects the wager, it forces a confrontation with the emotional and existential weight of religious questions. The wager also raises broader ethical questions about the role of self-interest in moral and spiritual life. Should belief be motivated by hope for reward or fear of punishment? Or should it arise from a deeper sense of meaning, purpose, or love? These are not questions Pascal fully resolved, but they remain relevant in discussions of ethics, psychology, and the foundations of religious commitment. Ultimately, Pascal's wager does not attempt to prove God's existence. It does not offer evidence for divine reality, nor does it resolve theological disputes. What it does offer is a framework for thinking about belief in the face of uncertainty, a recognition that sometimes, in the absence of conclusive proof, we must make choices based on values, priorities, and the consequences of being wrong. If belief can be a gamble, so too can happiness. But what if the happiest life is an illusion? Let's dive into Robert Nozick's thought experiment next. The experience machine. Would you plug into happiness? Imagine waking up in a sterile laboratory, surrounded by softly humming machines and quiet voices. A scientist explains that you are about to be given a choice, one that will determine not just the course of your life, but the very nature of your experience. You can continue living as you always have, with all its joys, disappointments, uncertainties, and struggles. Or you can be connected to what they call the experience machine, a device capable of generating any sensation, emotion, or perception you desire. Once plugged in, you would live a life of unbroken happiness. Every ambition would be fulfilled, every relationship perfect, every moment infused with joy. And crucially, you would never know the difference. The illusion would be complete. So, what do you choose? This thought experiment was introduced by philosopher Robert Nozick in his 1974 book Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He designed it to challenge the ethical theory of hedonism, the idea that pleasure or happiness is the ultimate good and the proper aim of human life. According to strict hedonism, if a machine could provide more pleasure than real life ever could, then there would be no rational reason to refuse it. Yet, as Nozick observed, most people instinctively recoil at the idea of plugging in. This suggests that our values extend beyond the pursuit of pleasure alone. The experience machine raises difficult questions about what gives life meaning. If we were guaranteed a life of perfect subjective experience, why would we hesitate? One answer lies in the distinction between feeling and being. We want not only to feel happy, but to be happy, to live lives that are authentic, meaningful, and grounded in reality. There is an intuitive sense that happiness derived from falsehoods, however pleasant, lacks the depth and significance of happiness earned through genuine relationships, personal growth, and lived experience. Even suffering has value when it contributes to a coherent narrative of selfhood. Nozick's thought experiment also exposes a deep-seated need for truth. Many people would reject the machine not because they distrust the scientists, but because they fear losing touch with reality itself. To live in a simulation, even a blissful one, feels like a kind of death, not physical but existential. It implies the end of autonomy, of agency, of being the author of one's own story. In choosing the machine, you surrender control over your experiences. They are programmed, not chosen. And while the illusion may feel indistinguishable from reality, the knowledge that it is constructed, artificial, casts doubt on the authenticity of any joy it produces. Another layer of resistance comes from our attachment to personal development. Human beings often define themselves in terms of their struggles and triumphs. We grow through adversity, mature through loss, and find meaning in overcoming obstacles. The experience machine offers none of this. It eliminates hardship, yes, but in doing so, it also removes the opportunity for resilience, courage, and perseverance. Without these challenges, many feel that life would lose its texture, its emotional richness. Happiness becomes static, unearned, and ultimately hollow. Moreover, the machine undermines the importance of connection. While it might simulate love, friendship, and companionship, those relationships would not be shared with real others. They would be illusions crafted by code. This raises the question, can happiness exist in isolation? Or does meaning require reciprocity, mutual recognition, and the unpredictability of other minds? Most people seem to believe that real relationships, flawed, messy, and sometimes painful, are irreplaceable. We do not merely want to feel loved. We want to be loved by someone who exists independently of us. It is worth noting that Nozick did not claim that the experience machine proves happiness is unimportant, only that it is insufficient as the sole criterion for a meaningful life. His argument is not against pleasure per se, but against the idea that pleasure alone constitutes the good life. The machine demonstrates that humans seek more than comfort. They seek purpose, identity, and truth, even if truth is painful. This dilemma has gained renewed relevance in the modern age. Today, we already live among technologies that simulate satisfaction. Social media platforms engineer engagement through dopamine-driven feedback loops. Video games offer immersive alternate identities. Virtual reality blurs the boundaries between simulation and experience. Pharmaceutical advances allow for mood regulation on demand. These developments do not yet constitute the full experience machine, but they suggest that humanity is inching closer to environments where artificial happiness can rival, or even surpass, what real life provides. This raises pressing ethical concerns. If individuals increasingly choose simulated fulfillment over real-world engagement, what happens to society? What happens to progress, creativity, and responsibility? As technology makes it easier to escape discomfort and uncertainty, the temptation to do so grows stronger. But the experience machine reminds us that the value of life cannot be measured solely by how it feels from the inside. Meaning emerges not just from what we experience, but from how we arrive at those experiences, and whether they are rooted in something real. Of course, the machine also forces us to consider whether our aversion to artificial happiness is justified. Is authenticity truly more important than well-being? If a person chooses the machine, knowing everything it entails, is their life less valuable simply because it is fabricated? These are not easy questions to answer, and perhaps they are meant to remain open-ended. They serve not as definitive judgments, but as provocations, an invitation to reflect on what we truly value and why. What is clear is that most people, when presented with the experience machine, would decline it, at least initially. That hesitation reveals something fundamental about human nature. We do not simply want to feel good. We want to live real lives, with all their imperfections and difficulties. We want to matter, to change, to be known, not just to ourselves but to others. If we reject artificial happiness, perhaps we should embrace cooperation instead. But why does it so often fail us? Let's look at one of the most famous paradoxes in game theory next. The prisoner's dilemma: why cooperation fails. The prisoner's dilemma is one of the most influential models in game theory, not because it offers solutions, but because it reveals the structural difficulties that prevent cooperation from emerging naturally. At its heart lies a simple scenario. Two individuals are arrested for a crime and placed in separate rooms. Each is given the same offer. If one confesses and implicates the other while the other remains silent, the confessor goes free while the silent one receives a long sentence. If both confess, they each receive a moderate sentence. If both remain silent, they both get only a short sentence due to a lack of evidence. The dilemma arises because each prisoner must choose whether to betray or trust the other, without knowing what the other will do. From a purely rational perspective, the optimal strategy appears to be betrayal. After all, if you believe the other person might betray you, then you should betray them first to avoid the worst outcome. And if you believe the other person will stay silent, you still benefit more by betraying them and going free. In either case, self-interest points toward confession. Yet when both prisoners act rationally in this way, they end up worse off than if they had both cooperated and remained silent. This paradox illustrates a broader truth. Individually rational decisions can lead to collectively irrational outcomes. It is a foundational insight into why cooperation often fails, even when it seems beneficial to all parties involved. This model was originally formulated in the 1950s by mathematicians Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher at the Rand Corporation, later formalized by Albert Tucker. Since then, it has been used to analyze a wide range of social, political, and economic phenomena. From international relations to environmental policy, from business competition to personal relationships, the prisoner's dilemma provides a framework for understanding how mutual defection can emerge despite shared interests in cooperation. One of the most striking applications of the dilemma is in global climate negotiations. Every nation agrees that reducing greenhouse gas emissions is necessary to prevent catastrophic climate change. However, each country also recognizes that if others reduce emissions while it continues to pollute, it gains an economic advantage without bearing the costs. As a result, nations hesitate to commit fully, fearing exploitation. The result is a collective failure to act decisively, an outcome that benefits no one. Similarly, in arms races between rival nations, both sides understand that maintaining large stockpiles of weapons is costly and dangerous. Yet each fears that if it disarms unilaterally, the other will take advantage. So both continue to build up arsenals, even though mutual disarmament would be preferable. The same dynamic plays out in corporate settings, where companies may agree that excessive advertising spending is wasteful, yet continue to compete aggressively, fearing that any moment of restraint will be exploited by competitors. The dilemma also appears in everyday life. Consider workplace dynamics. Employees may recognize that supporting one another leads to better overall conditions, but fear that others will undermine them for personal gain. Or in personal relationships, where honesty and vulnerability are mutually beneficial, yet difficult to maintain in the face of potential betrayal. In all these cases, the tension between self-interest and collective well-being remains unresolved. What makes the prisoner's dilemma so compelling is that it exposes a fundamental challenge of human interaction, the fragility of trust. Cooperation requires confidence that others will reciprocate, but such confidence is rarely guaranteed. Without assurance that others will cooperate, individuals have strong incentives to defect, to prioritize their interests over the group's. This is especially true when interactions are one-time rather than repeated. In single encounters, there is little incentive to cooperate if betrayal offers greater rewards with no future consequences. However, research into repeated versions of the dilemma, where participants interact multiple times, has shown that cooperation can emerge under certain conditions. Strategies like tit for tat, which begin with cooperation and then mirror the opponent's previous move, demonstrate that mutual trust can develop over time. These findings suggest that cooperation is not impossible, but requires mechanisms that encourage reciprocity and discourage exploitation. Still, the original form of the dilemma presents a sobering picture of human behavior. Even when cooperation is the best outcome, the logic of self-preservation often leads people to defect. This suggests that cooperation cannot be taken for granted. It must be structured, incentivized, and protected through rules, norms, or institutions. Without external enforcement or reputational stakes, cooperation remains vulnerable to breakdown. The implications extend beyond strategic decision-making to deeper questions about morality and ethics. Is cooperation inherently virtuous or merely advantageous? Should individuals act morally even when doing so comes at a personal cost? The dilemma does not answer these questions, but it does clarify the conditions under which ethical behavior becomes precarious. When there is no guarantee of reciprocity, moral action can appear foolish or naive, a sacrifice made in vain. Moreover, the prisoner's dilemma raises concerns about the limits of rationality itself. Classical economics assumes that rational actors make choices that maximize their utility. But when those choices lead to worse outcomes for everyone involved, the concept of rationality begins to look incomplete. Human beings are not always purely self-interested. They also value fairness, justice, and social cohesion. Yet within the rigid structure of the dilemma, these values are often overridden by the immediate logic of survival and advantage. This highlights a broader philosophical issue, the relationship between individual and collective good. Many ethical systems assume that the right course of action aligns with both personal integrity and communal benefit. But the prisoner's dilemma shows that such alignment is not automatic. There are situations in which acting ethically, by cooperating, can leave you worse off than those who act selfishly. This forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, fairness, and the difficulty of sustaining moral behavior in environments that reward defection. Despite its bleak implications, the prisoner's dilemma is not a condemnation of human nature. Rather, it serves as a diagnostic tool, one that helps identify the structural barriers to cooperation and informs efforts to overcome them. Legal frameworks, social contracts, and institutional design all attempt to modify the conditions of the dilemma, making cooperation more stable and sustainable. By changing the payoffs, introducing communication, or ensuring repeated interactions, societies can create environments where cooperation becomes not just possible, but rational. Yet the dilemma persists in many areas of life, reminding us that cooperation is not simply a matter of goodwill, but of careful design. It depends on incentives, transparency, and the ability to enforce commitments. Without these elements, even well-intentioned individuals may find themselves trapped in cycles of distrust and defection. Understanding the prisoner's dilemma is essential not only for strategists and policymakers, but for anyone interested in how human societies function, or fail to function. It reminds us that cooperation is fragile, that trust is hard-won, and that the path to mutual benefit is often obstructed by the very logic of self-interest. If cooperation fails, maybe time travel offers a way to fix the past. But what if changing history just creates more chaos? Let's explore one of the most famous time travel paradoxes next. The grandfather paradox. Can you change the past? Time travel has long captivated the human imagination, not only for its narrative possibilities in fiction, but also for the profound philosophical and scientific questions it raises. Among these, one paradox stands out as both foundational and deeply perplexing: the grandfather paradox. At its core lies a seemingly simple, yet logically explosive scenario. Imagine building a time machine and traveling back to an earlier point in history, say, to the life of your grandfather before he met your grandmother. In this hypothetical, you accidentally kill him, thereby preventing his future marriage, and with it, your birth. If you were never born, how could you have built the time machine and traveled back in time at all? This self-defeating loop illustrates the central problem of changing the past. If altering a prior event negates the possibility of that alteration ever occurring, then the very act of time travel becomes logically impossible. The paradox does not rely on emotional drama or speculative physics. It is a structural contradiction rooted in causality itself. It challenges our most basic assumptions about cause and effect, forcing us to reconsider whether time operates under fixed rules or something more fluid and complex. The grandfather paradox arises from two key assumptions. First, that time is linear and unidirectional, and second, that events in the past determine the present. These assumptions are deeply embedded in our understanding of reality. We experience time as a sequence. One moment follows another, and once something has occurred, it cannot be undone. But time travel introduces the possibility of violating this sequence, of inserting new causes into the past that disrupt the chain of events leading to the present. One way to approach the paradox is to examine it through the lens of physics. Classical Newtonian mechanics assumes absolute time, a background framework in which events unfold deterministically. In such a model, Any change to the past would ripple forward unpredictably, potentially erasing the traveler altogether. However, Einstein's theory of relativity complicates this view. According to general relativity, time is not a fixed backdrop, but a dimension interwoven with space, capable of warping and curving under the influence of mass and energy. This opens the theoretical door to closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that allow for backward time travel without violating known physical laws. Yet even within this relativistic framework, the grandfather paradox remains unresolved. If a person were to travel back in time and prevent their own existence, the resulting contradiction undermines the consistency of the timeline. This suggests that either time travel is fundamentally impossible, or that some mechanism prevents paradoxes from occurring when time travel is possible. One proposed resolution comes from the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. This theory posits that every possible outcome of a decision spawns a new branch of reality, creating parallel universes where each variation plays out independently. Applied to the grandfather paradox, this would mean that the time traveler who kills their grandfather does not erase their existence, but instead enters, or creates, a new timeline in which they were never born. The original timeline remains unaffected, preserving the conditions that allowed the time travel to occur in the first place. An alternative approach, sometimes called the Novikov self-consistency principle, argues that the laws of physics inherently prevent paradoxes by constraining what can happen. In this view, time travelers may find themselves unable to perform actions that would lead to logical contradictions. For example, the gun might jam, the traveler might miss, or some other unforeseen event might prevent the murder. From the traveler's perspective, free will appears intact, but the universe conspires to maintain internal consistency, ensuring that history remains unaltered. These models offer ways to avoid the paradox, but neither fully resolves the deeper issue, the nature of causality itself. The grandfather paradox forces us to confront the question of whether cause and effect are rigidly bound to a single timeline, or whether they can be rearranged in ways we do not yet understand. If the past can be altered, then what guarantees the stability of the present? And if it cannot, what prevents interference, divine intervention, natural law, or sheer coincidence? Beyond physics, the paradox also has implications for identity and agency. If a person's actions in the past can negate their existence, what does that say about the continuity of selfhood? Is identity tied to a fixed historical record, or is it malleable depending on the timeline in which it occurs? Furthermore, if time travel allows individuals to rewrite their personal histories, does this undermine the concept of responsibility? Can someone be held accountable for choices made in one version of the past if those choices no longer exist in another? More broadly, the paradox serves as a metaphor for the limits of human control over time. People often wish to undo past mistakes, to revisit decisions, and choose differently. Yet the grandfather paradox reminds us that tampering with the past, even hypothetically, can unravel the very fabric of causality. It suggests that time, like memory, may resist revision. What happened may be immutable, not because of divine decree, but because altering it would collapse the coherence of the entire system. In literature and science fiction, the grandfather paradox has inspired countless explorations of fate, destiny, and the consequences of meddling with history. But in philosophy and physics, it remains a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming that time behaves the way we expect. Our intuitions about time are shaped by everyday experience, where effects follow causes in a predictable order. Yet in the realm of theoretical physics, where time dilation and quantum entanglement challenge classical notions of simultaneity, the line between cause and effect may not be as clear-cut as we assume. The paradox also highlights the tension between determinism and free will. If time is a fixed structure, like a film reel that already exists in its entirety, then the idea of changing the past is meaningless. Every action, including time travel, would already be accounted for in the grand sequence of events. There would be no opportunity to alter anything, everything would simply unfold as it always had. On the other hand, if time is dynamic, if the future is genuinely open and the past can be rewritten, then the paradox exposes a fundamental flaw in the logic of backward time travel. A world in which time travelers can alter history is a world in which contradictions become unavoidable. Ultimately, the grandfather paradox does not provide answers so much as it sharpens the questions. Whether approached through the lens of physics, metaphysics, or narrative structure, it reveals the fragility of our assumptions about time. It reminds us that time is not merely a measure of duration, but a fundamental aspect of reality, one that may not behave according to the expectations of common sense. If time is uncertain, so too is meaning. In a universe of infinite possibilities, can anything truly be unique? Let's explore Jorge Luis Borges' infinite library next. The Library of Babel, is meaning hidden in chaos? The Library of Babel presents a vision of knowledge so vast that it transcends comprehension, an infinite archive containing every possible book that could ever be written, using a finite set of characters. Every combination of letters, numbers, and punctuation appears somewhere within its endless corridors. Masterpieces of literature, forgotten histories, scientific discoveries yet to be made, philosophical treatises, personal confessions, even this very sentence. But alongside these treasures lie volumes filled with gibberish, pages upon pages of random symbols, unreadable texts, and false information indistinguishable from truth. The library contains all knowledge, but also all falsehoods. It holds everything that has been said, and everything that never was or never will be. This idea originates from the short story The Library of Babel, written by Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges in 1941. In his telling, the universe itself is the library, a hexagonal labyrinth stretching infinitely in all directions, its shelves lined with books of identical format, each composed of the same 25 orthographic symbols. The implication is staggering. If all possible combinations exist, then somewhere in the library lies the complete works of Shakespeare, the history of every civilization, the solutions to every mystery. And yet, just as surely, there are countless variations of those same texts, slightly altered, misleading, or entirely fabricated. There is no guarantee of authenticity, no guide to distinguish the true from the false. All meaning exists, but none can be trusted. At first glance, this may seem like an abstract literary device, a poetic metaphor for the overwhelming nature of information. But the concept resonates deeply with modern concerns about knowledge, reality, and the search for truth in an age of digital abundance. In many ways, we already live inside a version of the Library of Babel. The internet functions as a near-infinite repository of data, where genuine insight coexists with misinformation, propaganda, and noise. Search engines return results in milliseconds, yet the burden of interpretation remains ours. We are surrounded by words, images, and ideas, but how do we determine which ones matter? Borges' library illustrates a fundamental problem of epistemology, the distinction between information and meaning. Information, in its raw form, is neutral. It simply exists. Meaning arises only when an observer interprets that information, assigning significance based on context, intention, and prior knowledge. A string of letters may appear meaningless until recognized as a code, a poem, or a hidden message. Yet in an infinite collection of possibilities, every pattern eventually emerges. Even those that seem meaningful may have arisen purely by chance. This raises a troubling question. If everything that can be expressed already exists, does anything truly originate from human creativity? Or are we merely discovering what was always present, waiting to be found? This notion unsettles our assumptions about originality and authorship. If all permutations of language are already recorded in some distant volume, then writing a new book is not an act of creation, but of discovery. A poet composing verses is not inventing something new, but locating a sequence that already resides in the library's depths. Similarly, Scientists uncovering laws of nature are not imposing order on chaos, but recognizing patterns that were always embedded in the fabric of possibility. From this perspective, the pursuit of knowledge becomes less about generating ideas and more about navigating an already existing sea of text. Yet navigation proves nearly impossible. Even if one knew precisely what they were looking for, the sheer scale of the library renders retrieval impractical. A single volume containing the cure for a disease might be buried among billions of similar-looking books, indistinguishable from nonsense. Without a catalog, a system of organization, or a way to verify accuracy, the library offers no reliable path to understanding. What begins as a place of infinite potential quickly becomes a place of despair, a labyrinth where certainty dissolves into confusion. This mirrors contemporary anxieties about information overload. In the digital era, we have access to more data than at any point in history, yet the challenge of discerning truth from error has never been greater. Algorithms feed us content tailored to our preferences, reinforcing biases and distorting perspectives. Misinformation spreads faster than verification. We are overwhelmed not by ignorance, but by excess, by too much data, too little structure, and no clear way to distinguish signal from noise. Moreover, the Library of Babel challenges our sense of individuality and purpose. If every thought, every decision, every life story has already been recorded, then what does it mean to think, decide, or live uniquely? Are we not merely following paths already laid out before us? The unsettling implication is that nothing is truly original. Not our ideas, not our emotions, not even our doubts. Everything we experience may have already occurred, endlessly replicated across different iterations of the library's contents. If so, the illusion of novelty is just that, an illusion. This leads to deeper metaphysical considerations. If all possible texts exist, then so too must all possible realities, at least in symbolic form. Somewhere in the library, there are books describing universes identical to our own, down to the smallest detail. There are versions of ourselves living slightly different lives, making alternate choices, experiencing divergent fates. There are entire histories that never happened, yet are as coherent as our own. In effect, the library becomes a model of multiverse theory, where every conceivable variation of existence plays out simultaneously, unseen but real in its way. But perhaps most disturbing of all is the suggestion that meaning itself is not inherent in the world, but imposed by the observer. In the absence of external guidance, we must construct our interpretations, choosing what to believe and what to disregard. This aligns with postmodern critiques of objectivity, which argue that truth is not discovered but constructed through cultural, linguistic, and cognitive frameworks. Within the library, meaning is not intrinsic to the text but assigned by the reader. This means that two people reading the same book might derive entirely different conclusions, one seeing wisdom, another seeing madness. And yet, despite the overwhelming chaos, we continue searching. We seek coherence in the randomness, order in the disorder. We write, read, and interpret because we cannot accept a universe devoid of significance. Even if meaning is not built into the cosmos, we create it ourselves, carving pathways through the infinite expanse of information. Perhaps that is the true function of consciousness, not to uncover pre-existing truths, but to generate meaning from the void. In Borges' vision, the library has no beginning and no end. Its architecture defies logic, its contents defy reason. And yet, within its walls, there is still hope. Somewhere, in the endless maze of ink and paper, there may be a book that explains everything. There may be a final answer, a definitive truth. But finding it would require knowing exactly what to look for, before you forget why you started searching at all. If meaning is fragile, so too is identity. Let's explore a modern twist on existential doubt, the Truman Show delusion. The Truman Show delusion. Are you the star of a hidden story? The Truman Show delusion presents an unsettling possibility, that one's life is not unfolding naturally, but is instead being curated, observed, or even directed by unseen forces. named after the 1998 film The Truman Show, in which the protagonist unknowingly lives his entire life inside a fabricated television set. This condition describes individuals who believe they are the central figure in a reality constructed around them. They report feeling watched, suspect that events are orchestrated for an audience, and interpret coincidences as scripted elements of a hidden narrative. While psychiatrists often associate this belief with delusional thinking, linking it to schizophrenia, paranoia, or other psychotic disorders, it also resonates with broader philosophical inquiries into the nature of reality, free will, and perception. At its core, the Truman Show delusion challenges assumptions about agency and autonomy. If someone believes their life is staged, they begin to question whether their choices are truly their own or merely part of a performance. This idea is not new. Throughout history, various thinkers have proposed that human experience may be shaped by external forces beyond our awareness. From Plato's allegory of the cave to Descartes' demon hypothesis, from Baudrillard's simulation of reality to modern discussions of digital consciousness, the notion that we may be living within a constructed framework has persisted across disciplines and eras. What distinguishes the Truman Show delusion from purely philosophical speculation is its psychological dimension. Unlike theoretical models of simulated existence, which remain abstract and speculative, the Truman Show delusion manifests as a lived experience, an internal conviction that one's reality is artificial, despite a lack of empirical evidence. Those who suffer from it often describe heightened awareness of patterns in daily life, an exaggerated sense of surveillance, and the belief that others are playing roles rather than acting freely. Some report feeling as though their environment reacts to them in ways that defy normal causality, as if the world itself were responding to their presence like a responsive set design. Psychiatrists caution against taking these beliefs at face value. In clinical contexts, the Truman Show delusion is generally classified as a type of delusional disorder, often falling under the category of delusions of reference, where individuals interpret unrelated events as personally significant. It is frequently associated with conditions such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or schizotypal personality disorder. However, the phenomenon resists easy categorization. Unlike more traditional delusions involving persecution or grandeur, the Truman Show delusion does not necessarily involve paranoia or irrational fear. Instead, it reflects a search for meaning, a desire to understand why things happen the way they do, and whether personal experiences are part of something larger. This raises difficult epistemological questions. If a person's perceptions align with known philosophical or scientific theories, such as simulation theory or determinism, should those beliefs still be dismissed as pathological? Or does the distinction between madness and insight depend on cultural context rather than logical consistency? After all, many ideas once considered absurd, heliocentrism, quantum mechanics, artificial intelligence, were later accepted as true. Could the Truman Show delusion represent an early, unrefined articulation of a deeper truth? From a philosophical standpoint, the condition echoes themes found in existential thought. Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger both explored the idea that individuals often live inauthentically, conforming to social expectations rather than defining themselves independently. The Truman Show delusion can be seen as an extreme manifestation of this concern, one in which the individual senses that their entire existence is dictated by external forces, leaving little room for genuine self-determination. Whether those forces are interpreted as divine intervention, government surveillance, or cosmic design depends on the person's worldview, but the underlying anxiety remains the same: the suspicion that life is not what it appears to be. It also intersects with contemporary concerns about digital manipulation and media influence. In an age dominated by mass surveillance, algorithmic curation, and social media personas, the boundary between authentic experience and manufactured spectacle grows increasingly blurred. People curate their online identities, present idealized versions of themselves, and consume content designed to shape their thoughts and behaviors. In such an environment, the idea that life might be performative, that our choices are subtly guided by invisible hands, begins to seem less like fiction and more like a plausible description of modern existence. Moreover, the Truman Show delusion parallels recent debates in neuroscience and cognitive science regarding the nature of free will. If our decisions arise from deterministic brain processes over which we have no conscious control, then the illusion of autonomy becomes indistinguishable from the delusion of being scripted. Both suggest that our sense of authorship over our lives may be illusory, that we are not the creators of our narratives, but merely actors following unseen cues. The difference lies only in how these ideas are framed, one as a neurological observation, the other as a psychological disturbance. This brings us to a crucial ambiguity. Where does philosophy end and pathology begin? Many individuals who claim to suffer from the Truman Show delusion do not exhibit other signs of mental illness. They maintain coherent speech, stable relationships, and functional cognition. Their distress arises not from hallucinations or emotional instability, but from a persistent, rational-seeming belief that their lives are being controlled or observed. Some attempt to test their suspicions, searching for inconsistencies, trying to break the script, or seeking confirmation through unusual behavior. When none is forthcoming, they may become trapped in cycles of doubt, questioning whether they are mad, deceived, or simply perceptive in ways others refuse to acknowledge. There is no consensus among experts about how to classify or treat the Truman Show delusion. Some argue that it should not be pathologized outright, especially when it does not impair daily functioning. Others contend that any persistent belief unsupported by empirical evidence qualifies as a delusion, regardless of its philosophical resonance. These debates highlight the difficulty of distinguishing between eccentricity and illness, between critical reflection and cognitive distortion. Beyond clinical considerations, the concept invites broader reflection on the nature of identity and perception. If our actions are shaped by genetics, upbringing, culture, and environment, how much of what we call self is truly independent? And if our experiences are filtered through subjective interpretation, could we all be living within some version of a constructed reality, just not the one imagined by those diagnosed with the Truman Show delusion? Ultimately, the condition serves as a mirror held up to society. It reflects anxieties about surveillance, authenticity, and the loss of control in an era of increasing technological mediation. Whether classified as a disorder or a philosophical stance, it compels us to ask uncomfortable questions. Is anyone ever fully free of influence? Are we all performing, knowingly or not? And if so, who, if anyone, is watching? If reality is a performance, then perception shapes the stage. But what if your mind is lying to you? Let's examine the unreliable narrator next. The unreliable narrator. Can you trust your mind? Human beings rely heavily on internal narratives to make sense of their experiences. We construct stories about who we are, how we got here, and what the future holds. These narratives provide coherence, continuity, and meaning. But what if these stories are not reliable? What if the very mind that interprets reality is itself an unreliable narrator, filtering, distorting, or even fabricating the world we believe to be real? The concept of the unreliable narrator originates in literature, where it describes a character whose account of events cannot be fully trusted. This may occur for many reasons. The narrator may be biased, delusional, emotionally compromised, or simply unaware of the full truth. In everyday life, this literary device has a profound parallel: our cognitive processes. Just as a fictional narrator shapes a story based on limited perspective or personal motivation, so too does the human brain interpret sensory input through subjective filters, assumptions, expectations, and emotional states that color perception before we are even aware of it. Cognitive science and psychology have long demonstrated that perception is not a direct window into reality, but an active construction by the brain. Our senses do not capture the world like a camera, They interpret fragments of data, filling in missing information based on prior knowledge and context. The same applies to memory. Studies show that recollection is not a playback of stored images, but a reconstruction, an attempt to piece together past experiences in ways that feel coherent, even if they are inaccurate. Memory is not only fallible, but suggestible. It can be altered by leading questions, emotional stress, or repeated exposure to false information. Over time, people can come to remember events that never happened, while forgetting details that did. This raises a troubling possibility. If your memories and perceptions can be reshaped without your awareness, how much of what you believe to be true is accurate? Consider the phenomenon of false confessions, where individuals genuinely recall committing crimes they did not commit, or the experience of déjà vu, where the brain momentarily misattributes familiarity to a novel situation. These are not isolated quirks of cognition. They are symptoms of a broader truth. Our minds do not simply record reality. They generate it. Moreover, the brain's tendency toward pattern recognition often leads us to impose order on chaos. We see faces in clouds, find hidden messages in random noise, and attribute intentionality where there is none. This inclination serves an evolutionary purpose. It is safer to assume a rustle in the bushes is a predator than to dismiss it as wind, but it also makes us vulnerable to self-deception. We do not merely perceive the world, we interpret it, and interpretation is always subject to distortion. In clinical settings, the unreliability of internal narration becomes even more evident. Patients with neurological conditions such as confabulation invent elaborate explanations for gaps in their memory, often with complete confidence in their accuracy. Others suffering from anosognosia, denial of illness, may insist they are perfectly healthy despite clear physical impairments. These cases illustrate that the brain does not always distinguish between fact and fiction. When faced with uncertainty or contradiction, it generates plausible explanations to maintain a sense of coherence, even if those explanations are demonstrably false. Philosophically, this aligns with skepticism regarding the nature of subjective experience. Descartes famously questioned whether he could trust anything other than his thinking, concluding, "I think, therefore I am." But even this foundational assertion assumes that thought equates to existence, a claim that remains contested. If thoughts themselves can be influenced by biochemical fluctuations, social conditioning, or unconscious biases, then the very act of doubting one's reality may itself be part of the illusion. Neuroscience further complicates matters by revealing the extent to which perception is mediated by expectation. Research into predictive coding models suggests that the brain constantly anticipates what it will encounter next, using past experiences to shape incoming sensory data. This means that what we perceive is not raw input, but a negotiation between external stimuli and internal assumptions. In essence, we do not see the world as it is, we see what we expect to see. This has significant implications for understanding ourselves and others. If two people witness the same event, yet report vastly different accounts, who is correct? If each person's version is shaped by their unique cognitive framework, then objectivity becomes elusive. There is no neutral observer, no privileged vantage point. All interpretations are filtered through layers of perception, language, and cultural background. Thus, the idea of a single definitive truth becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The implications extend beyond individual cognition to collective belief systems. History is filled with examples of widely accepted truths later proven false: geocentrism, phlogiston theory, and racial pseudoscience. These were not mere errors in reasoning. They were deeply held convictions supported by observation and logic at the time. Their eventual rejection underscores the provisional nature of all knowledge. Even the most confident assertions about reality must be tempered by the recognition that we may be wrong, not just about minor details, but about fundamental aspects of the world and ourselves. This realization forces a confrontation with epistemic humility. If our minds can deceive us without our knowing, then certainty must be approached with caution. Doubt, rather than being a failure of understanding, may be the most rational stance available. Rather than seeking absolute knowledge, perhaps the best we can do is remain open to revision, to accept that our current beliefs are provisional, subject to change with new evidence or insight. Yet this approach runs counter to human instincts. People seek closure, consistency, and confirmation of their worldview. To acknowledge that our minds may be deceiving us is unsettling. It undermines the stability of identity, challenges moral judgments, and casts doubt on personal history. It suggests that the self-entity that narrates our lives and claims ownership over thoughts and actions is not a fixed, transparent entity, but a dynamic process prone to error and self-justification. If the mind constructs its version of reality, then the search for truth must involve more than introspection. It requires external verification, critical inquiry, and a willingness to question even our most basic assumptions. It demands that we treat our thoughts not as infallible guides, but as hypotheses to be tested. And above all, it compels us to recognize the limits of human cognition, not as a weakness, but as a necessary condition of being finite, embodied creatures navigating a complex world. The idea that we might be living inside a constructed narrative, one shaped by memory, bias, and perceptual limitations, does not mean that reality is unknowable. It does suggest, however, that knowledge is not passive reception, but an active, uncertain process. Truth is not something handed to us intact. It is something we must continually refine, revise, and question. And if the mind is, in some sense, an unreliable narrator, then the pursuit of clarity becomes not just an intellectual exercise, but an ethical one. How do we navigate a world where perception is fallible, memory is mutable, and belief is often influenced by unseen forces? Perhaps by accepting that we are all, to some degree, mistaken, and that wisdom lies not in clinging to certainty, but in embracing the possibility of error. If there is no stable self, then what are we? Let's explore one of the most radical ideas in Eastern philosophy next. The no-self theory. Is there no you at all? The question of personal identity has long occupied the minds of philosophers, theologians, and scientists alike. We tend to assume that behind our thoughts, emotions, and sensations lies a stable, enduring self-OA, a central I that persists through time. This assumption feels intuitive. We speak of ourselves as unified entities, refer to past experiences as belonging to us, and anticipate future events from the perspective of a continuous consciousness. Yet, when examined closely, this notion begins to unravel. One of the most radical challenges to the concept of a fixed self comes from the no-self doctrine, known in Buddhist thought as anatta. It proposes not metaphorically but literally that there is no enduring essence behind experience. What we call the self is not a thing, but a process, an ever-changing flow of mental and physical phenomena with no permanent core. At its foundation, the no-self theory rejects the idea of an immortal soul or unchanging ego. In many religious and philosophical traditions, particularly those rooted in Western thought, the self is viewed as a constant presence, an inner substance that remains unchanged despite external transformations. The body ages, circumstances shift, memories fade, yet something within remains: the observer, the thinker, the experiencer. But according to anatta, this is an illusion. There is no central locus of awareness, no internal witness to our lives. Instead, what we perceive as selfhood is a dynamic interplay of 5 aggregates: form, the body; sensation, physical and emotional feeling; perception, the recognition of objects; mental formations, thoughts, intentions, habits; and consciousness, awareness of experience. These components are in constant flux, arising and passing away without any underlying entity to contain them. This view stands in stark contrast to dualist perspectives that posit a separation between mind and body, or between a soul and its transient vessel. In Buddhism, the belief in a permanent self is seen as one of the root causes of suffering. By clinging to the idea of an enduring I, individuals become attached to impermanent states, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, and resisting change. When those conditions inevitably shift, distress follows. The dissolution of the self, then, is not merely an abstract metaphysical claim, but a practical insight aimed at reducing attachment and liberating the mind from the burdens of egoic identification. From a psychological standpoint, modern neuroscience offers some support for this ancient view. Studies in cognitive science suggest that the brain does not house a singular center of consciousness. Rather, it functions as a distributed network, with different regions responsible for various aspects of cognition, emotion, and perception. There is no command center, where all sensory input converges into a unified experience. Instead, awareness emerges from complex interactions among neural processes, none of which can be identified as the true bearer of identity. This raises difficult questions about continuity and agency. If the self is not a fixed entity, how do we account for personal persistence? How can moral responsibility exist if there is no enduring subject making choices over time? These concerns have led some critics to reject the no-self theory outright, arguing that while the self may be fluid, it must still possess some minimal unity to explain memory, intentionality, and ethical accountability. Others accept the theory's implications but struggle with its emotional consequences. What does it mean to live without a center? One way to approach this is to consider the analogy of a river. A river appears to be a single, continuous entity, flowing from source to sea. But upon closer inspection, it is nothing more than water in motion, its boundaries shifting, its composition changing moment by moment. Similarly, human consciousness may give the impression of being a unified, persistent self, but in reality, it is a stream of transient mental states, none of which constitute a fixed identity. Just as a river is not the same from one instant to the next, neither are we. This understanding does not negate the practical necessity of a working sense of self. Social interaction, legal systems, and personal development all rely on the assumption of individual continuity. To function in the world, we need to believe that the person who made a promise yesterday is the same one expected to fulfill it today. But beneath these functional constructs lies a deeper truth. The self is not a substance, but a story we tell ourselves to make sense of experience. The implications of this realization extend beyond philosophy into everyday life. Many people seek happiness through self-improvement, striving to refine their character, achieve success, or attain greater self-awareness. But if the self is not a stable object to be improved, then such efforts take on a different meaning. They are not about perfecting a core identity, but about cultivating beneficial patterns of thought and behavior. Meditation practices in Buddhist traditions often aim at directly experiencing this insight, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a lived realization that dissolves the illusion of separateness and permanence. Some find this idea deeply liberating. Without a fixed self to defend or elevate, the compulsive pursuit of status, validation, and security begins to lose its grip. There is less fear of death, since there is no enduring entity to perish. There is also less attachment to rigid notions of ownership, less insistence that certain experiences belong exclusively to me, rather than being part of a broader unfolding of conditions. Others, however, find the no-self theory unsettling. If there is no you behind your thoughts and actions, what does that say about free will? About morality? If every decision arises from impersonal causes, how can anyone truly be held accountable? And if there is no real author behind experience, what motivates compassion, creativity, or love? These are not easily answered, and they illustrate why the doctrine of anatta remains both profound and controversial. It is important to clarify that the no-self theory does not deny experience itself. It does not claim that you do not think, feel, or act. Rather, it denies that these activities imply the existence of a separate, autonomous self. Seeing, hearing, and thinking all continue to occur, but without a permanent agent performing them. As the Buddha is said to have taught, just as the word chariot is a convenient term for an arrangement of parts, so too is the word self, a conventional label for a collection of fleeting elements. In contemporary discourse, the no-self theory intersects with debates in artificial intelligence, personal identity, and the nature of consciousness. If a digital copy of your mind were created, would it be you? If memories and personality traits can be transferred or altered, what remains of the original self? These questions mirror the concerns addressed by Anata centuries ago, suggesting that the dissolution of self is not only a spiritual insight, but a conceptual necessity in an age where identity is increasingly understood as information rather than essence. Ultimately, the no-self theory invites a reevaluation of what it means to be human. It does not offer comfort in the traditional sense, nor does it provide reassurance of an eternal soul. Instead, it encourages letting go, a release from the need to define oneself in absolute terms. Whether this leads to liberation or disorientation depends largely on how one approaches the idea. For some, it becomes a path toward acceptance. For others, it opens a void that resists easy resolution. If selfhood dissolves, so too does morality. Let's now confront one of the most disturbing ethical dilemmas in philosophy, the repugnant conclusion. The repugnant conclusion: is a world full of suffering better? At the heart of population ethics lies a paradox that defies moral intuition. The repugnant conclusion, introduced by philosopher Derek Parfit in his work on future generations and well-being. At first glance, it appears absurd, yet upon deeper examination, it reveals troubling inconsistencies in our ethical reasoning. The conclusion asserts that for any world with a high quality of life but relatively few people, there exists a morally preferable alternative, a vastly larger world where lives are barely worth living. According to this logic, a universe teeming with minimally happy individuals could be ethically superior to one containing fewer, but deeply fulfilled beings. This unsettling proposition forces us to reconsider how we weigh happiness against suffering, individual value against collective total, and moral obligation against practical intuition. Parfit's formulation arises from an exploration of utilitarian principles, particularly those derived from classical consequentialism. Utilitarianism evaluates actions based on their outcomes, aiming to maximize overall well-being. If happiness can be measured in units, what Parfit refers to as well-being levels, then increasing the number of happy individuals should, in theory, enhance total value. Even if each person's life is only slightly good, the sheer volume of existence might outweigh a smaller number of highly meaningful lives. This leads to what Parfit himself called the mere addition paradox, the idea that adding more lives, even ones of minimal satisfaction, can make the world better, provided they are not worse than nothing. To illustrate, consider two hypothetical worlds. In World A, 10 billion people live rich, flourishing lives filled with joy, creativity, and fulfillment. In World B, countless trillions of people exist in conditions just above neutral, lives that are not miserable, but far from ideal. Intuitively, most would find World A more desirable. Yet, according to certain interpretations of aggregative ethics, World B may have greater total well-being simply because it contains more individuals experiencing some degree of happiness. If morality demands that we seek the greatest net benefit, then World B could be considered ethically superior, despite its apparent bleakness. This conclusion feels repulsive to many, hence the term repugnant. It challenges deeply held beliefs about justice, dignity, and the meaning of life itself. Why should a world of barely tolerable existence be preferable to one of genuine flourishing? And why should we accept that quantity can outweigh quality in ethical evaluation? One of the central difficulties lies in defining what constitutes a life worth living. Philosophers often distinguish between negative and positive thresholds of well-being. A life below zero is considered worse than non-existence. One at zero is neutral. One above zero is positive, even if only slightly. If a life has any positive value, however marginal, then adding such a life improves total utility. However, when this principle is applied repeatedly, it leads to a disturbing endpoint. a world so densely populated that nearly all individuals live in conditions barely distinguishable from suffering, yet still technically above zero. This is sometimes referred to as World Z in Parfit's framework, a state where the vast majority of beings endure monotonous, low-quality lives, yet their sheer number makes the world ethically preferable under strict utilitarian reasoning. This paradox does not merely challenge abstract moral philosophy, it has real-world implications. For instance, it affects debates around procreation, environmental sustainability, and long-term planning for future generations. If bringing new lives into existence increases total happiness, even marginally, do we have a moral duty to do so? Should governments or societies encourage population growth regardless of the individual quality of life? These questions become especially urgent in discussions about artificial intelligence, digital consciousness, and post-human futures, where the potential for creating sentient entities is no longer speculative but increasingly plausible. Critics of the repugnant conclusion argue that it exposes a flaw in purely aggregative models of ethics. They contend that average well-being matters more than the total sum. A world with fewer, happier people may be preferable to one with many barely content individuals. Others propose alternative frameworks, such as prioritarianism, which prioritizes improving the worst-off lives rather than maximizing overall happiness. Still others invoke person-affecting views, which suggest that we have obligations only to those who already exist, or will exist independently of our choices, not to hypothetical beings whose lives depend entirely on our decisions. Yet none of these alternatives fully resolve the dilemma. Each introduces new complexities, trade-offs, or logical inconsistencies. For example, rejecting the repugnant conclusion while maintaining a commitment to utilitarianism requires modifying the standard aggregation model in ways that appear arbitrary or ad hoc. Similarly, emphasizing average well-being raises troubling implications. If a small group of extremely happy individuals is ethically superior to a large group of minimally happy ones, does that justify reducing population size through exclusion or even elimination? More fundamentally, the repugnant conclusion forces us to confront our assumptions about value. Is the mere fact of existence inherently valuable? If so, how much suffering is acceptable if it comes with a glimmer of joy? And if we reject the conclusion, must we also reject the idea that every life has intrinsic worth? The paradox also highlights the limitations of numerical reasoning in ethics. Human moral intuitions are shaped by empathy, context, and relational experience, factors that resist quantification. When faced with the idea of trillions of minimally happy lives, we recoil not because we lack mathematical rigor, but because we recognize something missing from the equation: depth, richness, and the qualitative dimensions of human experience. Numbers alone cannot capture the difference between a life of meaning and a life of mere endurance. Beyond ethics, the repugnant conclusion intersects with broader existential concerns. It mirrors anxieties about overpopulation, resource scarcity, and the sustainability of growth-based economic systems. In a world where optimization often favors scale over substance, the conclusion serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked expansion, whether of population, technology, or moral logic itself. Moreover, the repugnant conclusion raises difficult questions about responsibility. If we have the power to shape the future of humanity through policy, reproduction, or technological intervention, what kind of world should we aim to create? Should we prioritize the flourishing of a manageable number of individuals, or strive for maximal existence, even at the cost of diminished well-being? These dilemmas extend beyond philosophical debate into the realm of policy and planning, particularly in discussions about space colonization, AI-generated consciousness, and long-term survival strategies. Ultimately, the repugnant conclusion does not offer definitive answers, nor does it advocate for any particular course of action. Instead, it functions as a mirror, reflecting the tensions between different ethical priorities. It compels us to ask whether our moral frameworks are robust enough to guide decisions about the future of conscious life. And it reminds us that ethical reasoning, like mathematics, can yield results that are logically sound yet emotionally intolerable. If rare events can reshape history, what does that say about the future? Let's explore Nassim Taleb's Black Swan theory next. The Black Swan effect: how rare events shape history. History does not unfold in neat, predictable sequences. Though we often construct narratives that suggest otherwise, framing the past as a chain of cause and effect, reality frequently defies such orderly interpretation. Some of the most consequential events in human history were not anticipated, not because they were unknowable, but because they did not conform to existing models of understanding. These are black swan events, rare, high-impact occurrences that reshape societies, economies, and ideologies in ways that seem obvious only in hindsight. The term was popularized by philosopher and former trader Nassim Taleb in his 2007 book The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable, where he used the historical example of black swans, once thought non-existent until observed in Australia, to illustrate how unexpected events upend assumptions and expose the fragility of human foresight. A black swan event possesses three key characteristics: rarity, extreme impact, and retrospective predictability. First, it lies outside the bounds of regular expectations because nothing in the past suggests its likelihood. Second, it carries an outsized consequence, altering the trajectory of history in profound and often irreversible ways. Third, after it occurs, people tend to fabricate explanations that make the event appear more predictable than it ever was before. This retrospective rationalization gives the illusion of control, reinforcing the belief that we can anticipate and manage future surprises, despite evidence to the contrary. Examples of black swan events abound. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the Internet, the outbreak of World War I, the invention of the printing press, and the discovery of penicillin all fit this model. More recently, the global financial crisis of 2008, the emergence of artificial intelligence, and the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic have been interpreted through the lens of black swan theory. Each of these events reshaped the world in ways that could not have been reliably predicted, yet afterward, analysts and historians constructed elaborate accounts attributing them to identifiable causes. This pattern reveals a fundamental flaw in human cognition: our tendency to impose order on randomness. We seek patterns, assign meaning to coincidence, and build predictive frameworks based on limited data. Our institutions, from financial markets to political systems, are structured around the assumption that the future will resemble the past. Yet the very nature of rare events ensures that they defy such expectations. No amount of historical observation could have confirmed the existence of black swans before their discovery. Likewise, no amount of economic forecasting could have fully prepared for the cascading failures that led to the 2008 crash. Taleb argues that the danger lies not just in our inability to predict black swan events, but in our overconfidence in systems designed to prevent them. Many modern structures, whether financial instruments like derivatives or algorithmic decision-making in governance, are built on probabilistic models that assume stability and linear risk distribution. But real-world systems are far more complex and nonlinear. Small perturbations can lead to massive disruptions. A single technological breakthrough can render entire industries obsolete. A localized health crisis can spiral into a global catastrophe. And yet, despite these lessons, we continue to design systems that are brittle rather than resilient, vulnerable rather than adaptable. This raises a broader epistemological concern. What can we truly know about the future? Traditional statistical methods rely on normal distributions, bell curves, that assume most outcomes cluster around an average, with extremes being vanishingly rare. But many aspects of human experience, particularly in domains like finance, politics, and technology, follow power law distributions, where extreme deviations are not only possible but inevitable. In such environments, large-scale unpredictability is not an exception, it is the rule. Moreover, black swan events do not merely disrupt the present, they redefine the way we understand the past. Historical narratives are often rewritten to accommodate major shocks, making them seem less surprising than they were. The collapse of the Soviet Union, for instance, now appears to have been foreshadowed by economic stagnation and political unrest. But before its occurrence, few experts predicted the precise timing or manner of its dissolution. Similarly, the rise of AI has been framed as a natural progression of computing power, yet when machine learning models began surpassing human performance in tasks like image recognition and language generation, it caught even specialists off guard. The implications extend beyond historical analysis into ethical and strategic decision-making. If rare events carry disproportionate influence, should we not prepare for uncertainty rather than attempt to forecast specific outcomes? Taleb advocates for what he calls anti-fragility, a system's ability not just to withstand shocks, but to benefit from disorder. Rather than building fragile infrastructures that collapse under pressure, we should design adaptive ones that grow stronger in response to volatility. This applies not only to economies and governments, but to personal resilience, scientific inquiry, and philosophical outlook. Yet, despite repeated exposure to black swan events, society continues to operate under the illusion of control. Risk assessment models are calibrated to known threats, while unknown unknowns remain unaccounted for. Regulatory frameworks evolve in reaction to past crises, often failing to address new vulnerabilities. Educational systems train individuals to think within established paradigms, rarely equipping them to navigate ambiguity or radical change. The result is a cycle in which each surprise blindsides us anew, even as we claim to learn from previous mistakes. This brings us to one of the most unsettling aspects of the black swan effect, the limits of knowledge itself. We cannot know what we do not know, and worse, we often do not realize the extent of our ignorance. This is not a failure of intelligence, but a structural feature of cognition. Human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, prone to confirmation bias and overfitting data to pre-existing theories. When faced with uncertainty, we default to narratives that provide comfort, even if those narratives are incomplete or misleading. The black swan theory does not advocate fatalism, nor does it suggest that planning is futile. Rather, it emphasizes the need for humility in the face of complexity. It challenges the notion that expertise guarantees foresight, that progress eliminates risk, or that history unfolds according to a comprehensible arc. Instead, it reminds us that the most transformative moments are those we least expect, and that preparing for the unpredictable may be more valuable than predicting the familiar. One might argue that black swans are simply outliers, statistical anomalies that do not invalidate general principles. But in domains where consequences are severe, such as nuclear policy, epidemiology, or artificial intelligence, even low-probability events demand serious consideration. A single miscalculation, a single accident, a single unforeseen development can alter the course of civilization. This underscores the importance of redundancy, diversification, and decentralized decision-making strategies that increase robustness against unforeseen disruptions. In essence, the black swan effect forces a re-evaluation of how we approach risk, knowledge, and progress. It challenges the hubris of prediction and exposes the limitations of conventional wisdom. It does not offer certainty, nor does it provide a roadmap for avoiding disaster. What it does offer is a sobering reminder. The world is shaped not only by the expected, but by the improbable. And those who fail to account for the unexpected are often the first to suffer its consequences. If rare events can break the world, small changes can break logic. Let's explore the Sorites paradox next. The Sorites paradox. When does a heap become not a heap? At first glance, the Sorites paradox appears trivial, almost absurd in its simplicity. Imagine a heap of sand. Now imagine removing one grain at a time. After each removal, the pile remains a heap. But at some point, after enough grains have been taken away, it ceases to be a heap. The paradox arises from the question, at what precise point does this transition occur? There seems to be no definitive answer. No single grain of sand transforms a heap into a non-heap, yet the transformation undeniably happens. This seemingly minor linguistic puzzle reveals a deep structural challenge in how we define categories, draw boundaries, and understand gradual change. The paradox is traditionally attributed to the ancient Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus, though its implications have been explored by logicians, linguists, and philosophers for centuries. Its name comes from the Greek word soros, meaning heap. At its core lies the problem of vagueness, how language deals with concepts that lack sharp boundaries. Terms like heap, tall, rich, or old are inherently imprecise. They describe conditions that vary along a continuum, rather than existing in discrete states. Yet despite this fluidity, we treat them as if they were binary. Either something is a heap, or it is not. Either someone is bald, or they are not. Either a person is conscious, or they are not. These dichotomies break down when applied to continua, revealing the limitations of our conceptual frameworks. One might attempt to resolve the paradox by setting an arbitrary threshold, for example, declaring that a heap must contain at least 1,000 grains of sand. But such definitions feel artificial. If 1,000 grains make a heap, why not 999? Or 500? Any boundary drawn appears arbitrary, which undermines the very idea of precision in such cases. The paradox demonstrates that vague terms resist clear-cut classification, and attempts to impose strict thresholds often lead to contradictions or absurdities. This issue extends far beyond sand. Consider the concept of baldness. A man with a full head of hair is not bald. If he loses one hair, he remains not bald. But remove hair one by one, and eventually he becomes bald. At what exact moment did this happen? There is no definitive point at which the transition occurs, yet the change is undeniable. Similarly, consider the aging process. A child is young, over time they grow older. But there is no specific birthday that marks the transition from youth to adulthood in any universally meaningful way. Different cultures assign different significance to this shift, further illustrating the constructed nature of such categories. The implications of the Sorites paradox reach into more profound domains, including identity, ethics, and even metaphysics. For instance, if a person's moral character changes gradually, becoming more selfish, more courageous, or more compassionate, when do we say they have become a fundamentally different kind of person? Or if a nation undergoes slow political transformation, at what point can we say it has ceased to be the same country? These questions highlight the difficulty of applying rigid logic to phenomena that evolve incrementally. Even consciousness itself may fall victim to the Sorite structure. Neuroscientists and philosophers debate whether consciousness emerges gradually or exists in an on-off fashion. If a brain develops slowly, from neurons firing in simple patterns to complex interconnections, can we pinpoint the moment when awareness begins? Is there a final synapse that tips the balance from unconscious matter to subjective experience? Or is consciousness, like a heap of sand, a phenomenon that resists definitive classification? More troubling still is how the paradox challenges our understanding of legal and ethical distinctions. In law, many classifications rely on binary judgments. Someone is either guilty or innocent, alive or dead, competent or incompetent. But life rarely cooperates with such clarity. Consider end-of-life decisions. Modern medicine allows us to sustain biological functions long after consciousness has ceased. At what point does a person stop being a person? If a brain-dead individual is maintained on life support, is their body still a vessel for identity, or merely tissue animated by machines? These dilemmas illustrate how legal systems struggle with continuity and definition, much like language itself. In epistemology, the Sorites paradox also raises concerns about knowledge and belief. Suppose someone knows that a large collection of sand is a heap. As grains are removed, they continue to believe it is a heap. At some point, they will deny that it is a heap, but at no stage will they admit to having changed their mind. This suggests that belief, like language, can resist abrupt shifts even as reality subtly transforms. It calls into question the reliability of perception and judgment under conditions of gradual change. Philosophers have attempted various solutions to the paradox, though none fully satisfy all parties. One approach, known as epistemicism, asserts that sharp boundaries do exist, even if we cannot perceive them. According to this view, there is a precise number of grains that defines a heap, even if we don't know what it is. Another response, called supervaluationism, suggests that vague terms have multiple acceptable interpretations, and that truth depends on which interpretation is chosen. Thus, a statement like "this is a heap" may be neither true nor false in absolute terms, but only relative to a particular standard. Fuzzy logic offers another alternative, proposing that vague properties come in degrees. Under this framework, a heap could be very much a heap, somewhat a heap, or not a heap, with truth values represented on a spectrum rather than confined to binary extremes. While this model aligns better with human intuition, it complicates formal reasoning and decision-making, particularly in fields like law, science, and ethics, where clear distinctions are necessary. A more radical resolution suggests that vague terms should be abandoned altogether in favor of precise language. This would mean eliminating expressions like heap, replacing them with measurable quantities, such as specifying the number of grains. However, such an approach is impractical in daily life, where vagueness serves a functional purpose. Language relies on flexible, context-dependent terms to allow for efficient communication. Replacing every vague term with a precise one would render speech cumbersome and unworkable. Perhaps most importantly, the Sorites paradox exposes the limitations of classical logic when applied to real-world complexity. Traditional logic assumes that statements are either true or false, with no middle ground. But reality often operates in shades of gray. Vagueness is not a flaw in language, but a reflection of the world's inherent ambiguity. Our ability to navigate this ambiguity is part of what makes human cognition so powerful, but also what makes our reasoning prone to error. The paradox also reflects broader philosophical concerns about identity and personal continuity. If a ship gradually replaces all its parts over time, is it still the same ship? If a person changes physically and mentally across decades, are they still the same self? These thought experiments mirror the Sorites structure, suggesting that identity, like heaps, may be resistant to definitive classification. In both cases, the paradox forces us to confront the gap between our intuitive understanding of things and the logical inconsistencies that arise when we try to define them rigorously. Ultimately, the Sorites paradox reminds us that not all transitions are marked by clear demarcations. Reality often unfolds in gradients, and our language struggles to keep pace. We categorize, generalize, and define to make sense of the world, but in doing so, we risk oversimplifying the complexity of existence. The paradox does not offer a solution so much as it invites reflection. If we cannot precisely define when something changes, does that mean the change is not real, or simply that our tools for describing it are inadequate? If definitions fail us, perhaps identity does too. Let's explore a thought experiment that asks whether you'd still be you after a radical transformation. The vat of acid thought experiment. Would you press the button? Imagine standing before a machine that promises something extraordinary, a perfect replica of yourself, complete with all your memories, personality traits, and subjective experiences. The catch? To create this new version, your current body must be destroyed. You are told that the copy will step out from across the room, convinced it is you, feeling no different, remembering everything, behaving identically. Would you press the button? This thought experiment, often referred to as the vat of acid scenario or the teleportation paradox, was explored in depth by philosopher Derek Parfit, though its roots extend into science fiction and metaphysical speculation. At first glance, the question seems simple. If someone behaves like you, talks like you, and remembers being you, then surely they are you. But upon deeper reflection, the issue becomes far more complex. It forces us to confront the nature of personal identity, continuity, and survival, not just what we mean when we say I, but whether that I can survive discontinuity at all. The experiment hinges on the distinction between psychological continuity and physical continuity. If identity is preserved through memory and personality alone, then the copy stepping out may indeed be considered the same person who pressed the button. However, if identity depends on some form of unbroken biological or conscious thread, then the original self ceases to exist, and the copy is merely an imitation, an entity that believes itself to be you, but is not. This dilemma mirrors real-world philosophical debates about teleportation and mind duplication. In many science fiction narratives, characters use teleporters that disintegrate their bodies at one location and reconstruct them elsewhere. From the traveler's perspective, the process feels instantaneous. There is no perceived gap between disappearance and reappearance. Yet if the original is truly destroyed and only a duplicate remains, then the experience of continuity is illusory. What survives is not the same consciousness, but a successor, one that inherits the memories and behaviors of the predecessor without actually being them. From a third-person standpoint, the difference may seem negligible. The copy would continue life exactly as the original would have, working the same job, maintaining the same relationships, pursuing the same goals. No one else would notice any change. But from the first-person perspective, the internal viewpoint of the individual pressing the button, this raises a deeply unsettling possibility. The moment you choose to undergo the process, you die. The being that emerges afterward may think it is you, but from a subjective point of view, it is not. There is no continuity of awareness, no persistence of the self. Instead, the original stream of consciousness ends, replaced by a new one that merely mimics it. This leads to a broader question: does identity reside in the pattern or the substrate? If a person's brain were scanned in perfect detail and then replicated in another medium, say, a synthetic brain or digital environment, would that replication be the same person? Or would it simply be a copy, no matter how exact? This problem touches on what philosophers call the uniqueness problem. If multiple identical versions of a person exist, which, if any, can claim to be the authentic continuation of the original, many people intuitively recoil at the idea of pressing the button. Even those who accept that the copy would functionally be them hesitate, sensing that something essential is lost. That hesitation suggests that our sense of selfhood is not entirely reducible to information patterns. There appears to be something irreducible about the first-person experience, something that cannot be transferred, copied, or resumed after interruption. If that is true, then no amount of fidelity and replication can preserve what matters most, the ongoing existence of the self. Others argue differently. They contend that personal identity is not something that persists through time in a literal sense, but rather something constructed through memory and behavior. If the copy has all your memories, then it will believe itself to be you, and for all practical purposes, act as you do. From this perspective, death is not an obstacle to continuity because the self was never a fixed entity to begin with. Identity is fluid, dynamic, and distributed. What matters is not the preservation of a single continuous thread, but the maintenance of recognizable traits over time. This debate also intersects with questions about the nature of consciousness. If consciousness is an emergent property of brain activity, then destroying the brain and replacing it with an identical structure should result in a similar form of awareness. But if consciousness is somehow tied to a specific physical instantiation, a particular neural network or quantum state, then even a perfect copy would represent a new instance of awareness, disconnected from the previous one. There is no definitive resolution to this puzzle. Both perspectives contain logical appeal, yet neither fully satisfies the emotional weight of the choice. The discomfort arises precisely because the experiment reveals the fragility of our assumptions about identity. We often take for granted that we remain the same person from moment to moment, that our thoughts flow continuously, and that we endure through time. But when faced with a situation where that endurance is broken, even hypothetically, it becomes clear that our sense of self is not as stable as we assume. Moreover, the vat of acid experiment highlights a fundamental tension between functional equivalence and existential continuity. Many ethical and legal systems treat identity as something that can persist despite physical change. A person who loses limbs, receives organ transplants, or undergoes major cognitive shifts due to trauma or disease is still legally and socially recognized as the same individual. But when the physical basis of identity is completely replaced, even perfectly, our intuitions falter. This paradox also raises moral concerns. If the copy is indistinguishable from the original, does it deserve the same rights and responsibilities? Would it be ethical to destroy the original, knowing that a seemingly identical replacement exists? And if it is wrong to kill someone, even if a perfect duplicate takes their place, does that imply that consciousness carries intrinsic value beyond behavioral output? In a world increasingly shaped by technology, these concerns are not purely theoretical. Advances in neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and bioengineering suggest that future societies may face decisions about identity, duplication, and transferability of consciousness in ways we are only beginning to imagine. Whether we are prepared for those dilemmas remains uncertain. The vat of acid experiment does not offer answers so much as it sharpens the questions. It compels us to define what we mean when we say I. Is identity defined by memory, by biology, or by something more elusive, like the unbroken stream of awareness? And if that stream can be interrupted and restarted, is it truly the same stream at all? Ultimately, the decision to press the button, or not, reveals more about our beliefs than about the nature of reality. Some may choose to trust in the continuity of the self, believing that identity persists regardless of physical changes. Others may recognize that the self is not a substance, but a process, and that processes can be duplicated, but not continued. If time travel allowed us to undo mistakes, would we even have the right to do so? Let's explore the ethics of changing history next. The ethics of time travel. Who has the right to change history? The idea of time travel has long captivated human imagination, not merely as a technological or scientific possibility, but as an ethical dilemma of profound consequence. The ability to revisit and revise the past introduces not only the opportunity for correction, but also the risk of unintended destruction. If one could undo historical atrocities, prevent wars, stop genocides, or save lives lost to tragedy, would it be morally obligatory to do so? Or would such interventions carry consequences so unpredictable that they render any action ethically indefensible? These are the central questions of time travel ethics, a speculative yet philosophically rigorous field that explores the moral implications of altering history. At its core, time travel ethics grapples with causality and responsibility. Unlike most ethical decisions, which involve shaping the future based on present actions, time travel allows individuals to act retroactively, introducing new causes into events that have already occurred. This disrupts conventional moral reasoning, which typically assumes a linear progression from action to effect. In time travel scenarios, effects may precede their cause or never occur at all, due to alterations made in the past. This creates a complex web of moral uncertainty, where even well-intentioned actions may yield catastrophic outcomes. One of the primary concerns in this domain is the butterfly effect, a term borrowed from chaos theory, referring to how small changes in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes over time. In the context of time travel, this means that even minor alterations to the past might ripple outward in ways that cannot be foreseen. Saving a single life might prevent the birth of someone whose descendants would later change the course of history. Preventing a war might allow a worse conflict to emerge in its place. Correcting a personal mistake might erase years of growth and experience that arose from dealing with its consequences. These possibilities suggest that what appears beneficial in the short term may prove disastrous in the long run. This raises a troubling question. If we cannot predict the full consequences of our actions in real time, how can we possibly anticipate them when acting across temporal boundaries? Ethical decision-making usually depends on some degree of foresight, but in time travel, that foresight is inherently limited. No matter how carefully one plans, the complexity of historical interdependencies ensures that no outcome is entirely foreseeable. Thus, even the most altruistic intentions may result in unforeseen suffering. Another layer of complexity involves the issue of who gets to decide. Even if time travel were possible, who holds the authority to determine which moments in history should remain untouched and which should be altered? Governments? Historians? Scientists? Individuals with personal stakes in the past? There is no universally accepted framework for making such decisions, and any attempt to establish one would likely be contested. Some might argue that preventing mass suffering justifies intervention, while others might insist that every event, no matter how tragic, has contributed to the world we inhabit today. To alter the past, then, could mean erasing not only pain, but entire identities, cultures, and futures that depend on the sequence of events as they unfolded. Consider, for instance, the moral weight of erasing individuals. Suppose a time traveler prevents a violent death by intervening at the right moment. That person survives, but what if their survival alters the trajectory of history in ways that eliminate other lives? If those lives had been meaningful, would the act of saving one individual justify the loss of others who would have otherwise existed? And if we accept that changing the past affects who comes into being, then we must confront the unsettling notion that there is no fixed set of people whose interests deserve consideration, only shifting configurations of existence shaped by temporal interference. A related concern is whether time travelers bear moral responsibility for unintended consequences. Traditional ethical frameworks often distinguish between intentional harm and accidental harm, assigning greater blame to deliberate wrongdoing. But in time travel, intent becomes secondary to impact. A person might enter the past with the best of intentions, only to return to a drastically altered present where nothing is as it was. In such cases, can moral culpability be assessed? Or does the sheer unpredictability of historical change absolve the traveler of responsibility? Some theorists propose that the only truly ethical stance toward time travel is non-interference. Much like the Prime Directive in Star Trek, this principle suggests that altering the past, even with noble motives, carries too many unknown risks. From this perspective, the integrity of history should be preserved unless the necessity of intervention is certain. But certainty is rarely available, especially in matters of history, where cause and effect are often obscured by decades or centuries of development. This leads to another philosophical challenge, the concept of moral relativism across timelines. What seems unethical in one version of history may be necessary in another. A tyrant who caused immense suffering might also have inadvertently prevented an even greater catastrophe. A failed revolution that led to repression may have ultimately paved the way for a more stable society. Because history unfolds as a singular sequence of events, we cannot compare alternate versions of the past. We see only what happened, not what might have happened had things gone differently. This makes retrospective judgment difficult, and perspective alteration even more so. There is also the issue of consent. Those living in the present cannot grant permission for changes to the past, nor can those in the past give consent to be changed by future actors. This creates a unique asymmetry in ethical engagement, one in which decisions are made on behalf of people who had no say in the matter. It resembles the problem of intergenerational justice, where current choices affect future generations who cannot voice their preferences. In time travel, however, the imbalance runs both forward and backward in time. Even if time travel remains theoretical, These ethical considerations have practical relevance in contemporary discussions about memory, identity, and historical revisionism. Debates about removing statues, rewriting textbooks, or reinterpreting historical figures echo similar tensions. Should history be judged by modern standards? Should we attempt to correct past injustices through legal or cultural means, even if doing so reshapes collective memory in irreversible ways? These questions suggest that the moral dilemmas of time travel are not confined to science fiction. They are embedded in how we understand and engage with the past and the present. Perhaps the most disturbing implication of time travel ethics is the suggestion that someone may have already acted upon the past. If time travel is possible, and if the laws of physics permit branching or looping timelines, then history may not be a fixed record, but a malleable construct shaped by unseen hands. If so, we must ask, is our reality the product of careful stewardship or reckless experimentation? And if we suspect that history has been altered, how do we determine what is authentic and what is artificial? These uncertainties underscore the difficulty of applying traditional moral principles to time travel. Consequentialist ethics, which evaluates actions based on their outcomes, struggles because the outcomes of time travel are unknowable. Deontological ethics, which emphasizes duty and rule following, offers little guidance when no rules exist. Virtue ethics, which focuses on character and intention, fails to resolve the question of whether good intentions are enough when the results are beyond control. Ultimately, time travel ethics forces us to reconsider the nature of moral responsibility itself. If we cannot know the full consequences of our actions, can we ever claim to act ethically? And if we possess the power to rewrite history, would wisdom lie in restraint rather than intervention? If we cannot change the past, maybe we can glimpse the future. But what if knowing the truth destroyed you? Let's end our journey with the most haunting question of all. What is the one thing you want to know before death? As life nears its end, certain questions become unavoidable, not because they have definitive answers, but because they define what it means to be human. Among these, one stands apart. What is the one thing you want to know before death? This question cuts through distractions, bypasses social expectations, and strips away pretense. It asks not for a list of curiosities or trivia, but for the single truth that, if known, would most profoundly shape how you understand your existence. The answer varies from person to person. Some may seek reassurance about an afterlife, others may desire certainty about purpose, while still others might simply wish to confirm whether their life mattered in any meaningful way. This thought experiment functions as more than a philosophical exercise. It is a mirror held up to individual priorities and collective concerns. It forces reflection on what we consider essential knowledge, what truths we believe are worth knowing even at the threshold of death. The very act of choosing a final question reveals something fundamental about the self, what we doubt, what we hope, and what we fear, not knowing until it is too late. Consider the nature of inquiry itself. Human beings are unique among living creatures in their persistent search for meaning. We ask why things happen, what our place is in the universe, and whether our lives contribute to something larger. These questions are not always practical. They do not necessarily improve survival or enhance material comfort, but they persist nonetheless. Even those who claim indifference to such matters often reveal, upon deeper reflection, that they harbor quiet uncertainties about existence, identity, and value. Some might choose to ask about God. Does God exist? A deceptively simple question with vast implications. If the answer were affirmative, it would reframe everything: morality, destiny, suffering, and the possibility of continuity beyond death. If negative, it would affirm a different kind of truth, that all meaning is constructed, all significance self-imposed. Either way, the response would alter the final moments of awareness, shaping how one leaves this world, with acceptance, with awe, or with resignation. Others might turn inward. Did I matter? A question not about cosmic design, but about personal impact. Did my actions ripple outward in ways I never saw? Were there people I changed unknowingly? Moments where I made a difference without realizing it? This question reflects a deep human need, the desire to be significant, to feel that our time here was not indifferent to the universe. It acknowledges that much of life unfolds in obscurity, that many acts of kindness, sacrifice, and love go unnoticed. And yet, we want to believe that these things were not wasted. A third possibility involves fate. Was everything meant to happen this way? This version seeks reassurance that life was not random, that events were not arbitrary, but part of a larger pattern. It appeals to those who struggle with regret, who wish to believe that even mistakes served a purpose, that pain was not meaningless, that every sorrow contributed to some greater unfolding. It is a question rooted in the longing for coherence, for a story that makes sense of the chaos of lived experience. Still others might ask about consciousness. Is awareness eternal? This query does not concern the soul in a religious sense, but rather the persistence of subjective experience beyond death. If consciousness is purely physical, then the end truly is an end. But if awareness transcends biology, if it continues in some form, then dying becomes not a cessation, but a transition. The answer to this question would determine whether death is extinction or transformation. And then some might ask something far simpler, yet no less profound. Was this all just a dream? This question echoes themes found in philosophy, religion, and science fiction, from Plato's cave to Descartes' demon to modern simulation theory. It suggests that perhaps nothing was real in the way we believed. Perhaps this life was only a passing illusion, a fleeting moment in a broader context we cannot perceive. If so, what does that say about the urgency of our struggles, the weight of our choices, the depth of our emotions? The final question is not about acquiring information. It is about confronting what has been left unresolved. It exposes the gaps between what we wanted to know and what we were able to find out. It highlights the limitations of human understanding, the boundaries of knowledge, and the role of uncertainty in shaping our journey. Whether answered or not, the question serves as a reckoning, a recognition that life, however long or short, is defined by what we sought to understand and what remained beyond reach. Yet, even in the face of ultimate unknowability, the act of asking matters. It affirms the enduring human impulse to seek clarity, to pursue meaning, to resist surrendering entirely to mystery. In that sense, the question is not only about what we want to know, but about how we live in the absence of certainty. Do we cling to belief in the face of doubt? Or do we accept ambiguity as an intrinsic part of being alive? This brings us to a final paradox. Knowledge is both a burden and a relief. Knowing can bring peace, but it can also destroy illusions that sustained us. There is wisdom in ignorance, as well as danger in revelation. Some truths may be too much to bear, arriving too late to change anything, yet altering perception forever. Others may offer solace, confirming what we suspected all along, giving closure to a lifetime of questioning. In literature, myth, and film, characters sometimes receive final revelations before death, often too late to act on them, but not too late to understand. These moments are rarely triumphant. They are quiet, reflective, tinged with melancholy. They do not resolve past regrets or erase suffering, but they provide a final piece of clarity, a last glimpse into the structure of reality. Whether that glimpse brings comfort or despair depends on the nature of the answer, and on the questions we carry with us to the end. Ultimately, the final question is not meant to be answered definitively. It is meant to be contemplated, to serve as a guidepost for how we live, what we prioritize, and what we leave unspoken. It reminds us that meaning is not always given, but often chosen. The search for truth is not confined to grand discoveries, but is embedded in small, intimate reflections. And that even in the face of inevitable silence, the mind continues to seek understanding. So take a deep breath. Reflect on your final question. As we drift toward sleep, or whatever lies beyond, let these ideas settle gently into your mind. May they accompany you into rest or something deeper. Thank you for listening. Good night.